The day we were taken out of our home is a day I'll never forget. I woke up that day in complete darkness. The only sounds to be heard were the muffled voices coming from the television somewhere in the house, and the heavy breathing coming from my younger brother. He was still asleep. His body was not yet used to the near constant darkness. At that point, Aiden had only been down there with me for a month. He didn't win his birthday game this year. I was 17 before I lost so large. That was almost a year ago now. I felt bad that Aiden only made it to 12. He hadn't had much time to get used to the cruelty of these games. The day we were taken away started exactly the same as the 10 months leading up to it. Sitting in the darkness, listening to the voices from the television upstairs. We slept on the floor. If we wanted beds, we'd have to win them in a game. Beds weren't important enough, though. I needed to make sure that we won enough food to stay healthy. Everything we needed could be won. We just had to be lucky enough. It didn't used to be like this. Everything was fine before the stakes were raised. Mother always liked game shows. It was a fact that we knew since birth. We didn't horse around while she was watching her shows. You didn't yell, and you didn't interrupt. We weren't surprised when our lives started to share characteristics with our mother's obsession. It all started with the basic chore wheel. Better rewards for harder chores. Around the time I was 14 was when the game started to change. Mother seemed to be at her limit with trying to discipline us and decided to add a discipline wheel. My older sister called it the Wheel of Misfortune, and the name stuck. Savannah was only a year older than me, and we managed to get along pretty well. It was hard not to be close and protective of each other when our only parent acted insane over the smallest of things. The wheel had restrictions. You had to be at least 10 years old to play, and that saved Aiden a couple years of participating. Whenever we made the smallest of errors, the wheel came out, and we spun to learn the consequences of our actions. Some of the consequences were intensely harsh, and they grew worse as time passed. Scrubbing the floors with a cloth and bucket and writing lines soon turned into nights sleeping alone in the dark, unlit basement and losing meals. Savannah lost it around the time that physical punishment came into play, and with her outbursts about things being unfair came a new wedge on the board. Isolation. Mother was so pleased with the way her wheel of misfortune had finally come together with the high risks and high rewards. She even added the isolation risk to the special birthday wheel. That one offered the opportunity to have a chore and punishment-free day, the meals of your choice for a week, and regular birthday treats. It also offered the risk of isolation and separation. Separation was what Mother called sending us to the dark, cold, and damp basement. We'd go blanketless on the cement floor for however long our separation prize said. None of us knew what isolation meant, and we really did not want to find out. Aiden had never even spun the wheel when Savannah hit the isolation wedge. Birthday wheels are both the best and the worst ones. There are less options for the so-called prizes, so all the wedges are supersized. This also means it's highly likely to hit one of those unfavorable rewards. It was Savannah's 16th birthday when she hit the isolation wedge. I remember that moment precisely. The sound of the wheel spinning. The ticking sort of noise as the wheel spun slower and slower, and the absolute silence as the pointer stopped over a black wedge. Everyone was surprised. Of all the days she could have spun the unknown punishment, it was on her birthday. The rest of the day was calm. We all got dinner, no one got into trouble, and when it was time for bed, Mother and Savannah went for a walk outside. I stayed awake in bed for hours, just wondering how long the isolation would last. We woke up the next morning without Savannah. Mother told us she shipped her away to our grandmother's farm to deal with her unruly behavior. That day, Mother gave Aiden and I each a gift. Mine was a key on a necklace identical to the one my mother had been wearing around her neck all morning. Savannah never came home, and we never dared to speak out against our mother and risk even worse punishment. Things went on like that for a while, and Mother continuously found new reasons for us to spin the wheel. A few months before I turned 18, I lost big on the wheel. Mother had set it up with severe risks because I had gone to bed without putting away dishes the night before. My prize was a year in separation, with the bonus benefit of being allowed to spin the wheel for supplies once a day. I was allowed out of the room to do chores, but most of my time was spent sitting on the cold, wet floor in the basement. When I won the right to it, I received meals, but I had gone days at a time without eating while down there. When you're in separation, physical punishment is much more frequent since no one will ever see the evidence. Schools were called and told that whichever child was visiting a sick relative across the country and would be out for a while. Apparently Mother had told everyone that I had gone to live with my father, a man who I had never met or heard of. I suppose it makes sense for how long I was supposed to be away. I tried screaming the first few nights of my extended separation, but that didn't get me far. Our house is nearly a mile away from the neighbors. Everything around was just field and swamps. Mother didn't appreciate the screaming, and that gave me several nights of bruising and bleeding. 3/4 of the way through my allotted time was when Aiden lost large. It was his 12th birthday, and he didn't get the best prize. I was in shock when Aiden ended up in separation that same night. He only had 30 days. The day we were taken was the day his separation ended. That was the last day I ever woke up in the darkness. The last day I woke up to him breathing heavily across the room. Mother let him out, and not long after this is when it happened. Aiden was going to be going with my mother to the grocery store, and I would be staying, locked in the frigid basement. They were loading the groceries into the car when he did it. He ran, likely fearing that these punishments would have him disappear like Savannah had. Mother didn't waste time dealing with the open trunk and half cart of groceries. She immediately got in the driver's seat and followed him. He didn't even make it out of the parking lot before he gave up and got into the car. When he joined me in separation that afternoon, he told me that he was afraid she would run him over with the car if he had kept running. Only minutes after he had come into the basement, Mother brought down the wheel and a light. Aiden spun isolation, and Mother quickly ran upstairs. When she came back down, she gave me another key on a necklace, and grabbed Aiden by the arm, and left without saying a word. It was hours before there came knocking at the door. It was loud and echoed through the house, and I took a risk knowing that Mother hadn't come back into the house since leaving with Aiden. I screamed for help, and I shivered in the darkness when the knockings paused at my screams. Then came louder pounding, the front door being forced open, heavy footsteps running into the house. I responded to the knocking at the basement door with more panicked screams. These were the loudest sounds I had heard in almost a year. These were the only people outside of my family that I had heard speak in that long. I cried when they brought me outside. I hadn't left the house in so long. I was immediately taken away from the house, in the hands of the law and government to find me a suitable home. The people who surrounded me often spoke about obvious signs of abuse. I didn't know what to tell them, so for the first few days all I did was ask where my brother was. And they couldn't find him, or my mother. Eventually I was told that they came to my house because someone had seen the incident outside the grocery store and they wrote down the license plate. They were concerned that this woman might be abusing her children. I'm happy someone finally noticed something was wrong. We were all too afraid of the risk it would take to tell someone what was going on, and we had been kept on a leash too short to get the police involved. It was nearly a week after I was taken from the basement when they told me that they had found something buried in the trees on the edge of the swamp that was near our house. 2 large trunks were hidden there, but no keys were found in our house. When the boxes were pried open, they found the bodies of my siblings. If the trunks had been found sooner, Aiden would have survived. Or if he hadn't tried to run, he wouldn't have been sent there. I was told that they had both suffocated, buried alive. That's what happened. My mother is yet to be found. My siblings are dead, and every day it haunts me to know that I was wearing the keys to my siblings' coffins, while there was still time to save them. In 1997, a small island disappeared in the Pacific, engulfed in what only can be described as a massive weather event. It took with it the lives of 4 meteorologists and 1 pilot. Their bodies were, of course, never found. This event may not seem familiar, and that's because it never happened. At least, that's what the US government claimed. I worked for them in '97. I was a younger man then, tempted by the thrill of storm chasing. When they offered to sponsor my hobby, I accepted without a second thought, sure that I would be thrusted into the heart of the most deadliest situation imaginable. I in fact spent most of my time behind a computer screen, monitoring blimps on a radar and reporting my findings to my superiors. I wasn't the one to find the island in the Pacific. It landed on my desk one day, in order to keep an eye on this place, an uninhabited mark on my screen. For weeks I did constant checkups on this small place that had no abnormal patterns present. It began to confuse me. Why was I watching a place where nothing happened? And then it began. At first it seemed like a hurricane. It had all the features of one, except one. It hadn't formed over water. The storm had formed over the land itself, it seemed. My radar showed the ever-increasing weather clearly, and I noted it carefully in my report. For weeks I watched the island in the Pacific, and then I received a memo. My supervisors would begin working with me to study the island itself and track the odd patterns that were present. However, we were only aides to the others. 4 meteorologists would be sent to the island to observe the conditions for themselves and see what samples they could collect from the island and the atmospheric conditions near it. We would be sent their findings and do further analysis on them. While I would have preferred to be sent to the island myself, I was fine working behind the scenes, especially with the raise in pay that came along with this specific project. Our team was moved from our station into another room in our facility, and in the week preceding the meteorologist's search, we continued to observe dangerous patterns on the island. Talking among ourselves, we on the team suggested that the researchers not go, out of concern for their safety. The higher-ups did not agree with us though, and they told us that the research was of the utmost importance and it needed to be conducted. This news was blunt, and when it was given, it was definite and unwavering. In my boss's eyes, I saw something though, and I was surprised to see it. Fear. The meteorologists were taken to the island via a small plane. We on the team were not given anything but identifiers for them so we could track their findings. No names, just A, B, C, D, and P. P was for the pilot of the plane. The team was kept very unaware of everything going on, even in the terms of research being sent back. The meteorologists were told to use a code for what they had found on the island, which we would then give to our supervisors. It was strange reading reports of high levels of Klondike in the air and traces of beta in the soil. It was also secretive, so restricted from us. We were the middlemen and only there to receive these odd messages. The only actual person we were able to communicate with was the pilot, who was able to speak to us through a radio installed in his plane. This was hardly ever used though. The researchers' first week on the island was normal, excluding the code used. They relayed information back to us at a normal rate based on the findings. Everything seemed to run very smoothly. We monitored the weather they described on our screens, pouring rain, high winds, and hail. It was the second week where the real abnormalities began. The meteorologist stopped sending us reports. We tried every possible way to contact them, but only silence came from their end. Even our superiors seemed alarmed by this. They began to get involved. They visited our offices more and always were asking on the progress of the operation to get a signal. For a full week we heard absolutely nothing back. And then out of nowhere it came. One single transmission. 3 words that still fill me with dread when they creep into my head late at night when no one else is there. C is dead. And that was all. Immediately, our communications room was filled with people of high rank. Not only my superiors, but my bosses. They scrutinized those 3 words, searching for a story that wasn't written. We on the weather team stayed back and watched the chaos unfold in front of us, the men scrambling to find an answer. Then the second message came through. We'll continue mission as planned. It was so cold. Like the island, it was distant, isolated. We couldn't feel what was there in the words. If we could, I'm not sure we would have felt any better. What could we do though? We waited for the higher-ups to leave and continued our work without talking to each other. We kept quiet to ourselves, mulling over the strange horror that had taken our team by surprise. I doubt we could have told each other what we were really feeling that day, and even if we tried. The next day, I didn't really want to come to work. I felt drained and out of place. I was being taken for a ride that I didn't want to go on. I was kidnapped and held hostage by the circumstances I had put myself in. Apparently my team must have felt the same way because only half of us showed up that day. Strangely, the routine became normal again. The meteorologists began transmitting at a normal rate again, with their strange code made specifically for people that were not us. This went on for another week, and reports were coming in at a normal rate, and strangely it seemed that the event faded from our memory. That was until it happened again. It came again as we were all about to leave the office, as we packed up our satchels and put on our jackets. We received another transmission from one of the researchers that made us all stop in our tracks. Lost A&D. Unlikely they will return. Cannot continue with search. Investigation has shown positive. For God's sake, send help. Evacuation is needed. Release us from this hell. We were speechless. It truly was more than any of us can handle. Some left the room to get our supervisors, some left to get air, and a lot left and never came back. We were weather experts, not soldiers. Loss was not something we were used to. This message hit the team hard. Again, people crowded into our small room to gawk at our computer screens. But in my boss's eye, I saw no surprise, only regret. There were no transmissions for a while. To the team, this was almost a blessing. We were afraid of what the next message might be, so for us, it was better not to hear back at all. There were only a few of us left on our team now. Our small computer room had become a terrifying portal to a strange land. On our screens, the storm still raged, only getting more intense every day. It grew in size and density, expanding grotesquely before our eyes. It was the following Tuesday that we received our final word from the island. We had had no transmissions for 5 days, apart from the spare letters and numbers that made absolutely no sense. We all jumped when the crackling came from the radio we used to communicate with the pilot. It began as heavy breathing, compressed under a layer of static. I quickly tuned the radio to find the most clear frequency. A shrill female voice cut through suddenly. Not the male pilot I had heard before, and I leaned forward to listen. Under all counts, I know what I have done is treason. If you are reading this, please, allow me to return. You do not know the horrors here. Please, let me return. Beneath her desperate cries, the sound of a storm raged. After the radio transmission, she still spoke, uttering prayers and repeating her last statement over and over again. For 5 minutes she did this. We sat with our hands, covering our open mouths, unsure how to proceed. Someone went to tell the supervisor, but he never came in to see. There were no onlookers this time, just our team and the sounds of the radio. After those 5 minutes, her prayers turned into a shriek. She shouted, and then the radio transmission cut out. On our computer screens, the storm completely overtook the island. It increased drastically in size, density, and speed. All of the team left the room except for me. Some cried, others were too shocked to speak, but I stayed, infatuated by what I saw displayed on the screen. The storm moved so fast. I watched it as it moved, breaking apart, and I saw the pieces move into the ocean. As the storm cleared, I refreshed my screen to make sure I hadn't encountered a glitch in my system. The island was gone. I was offered a large severance package the next day. They thanked me for my help on the project. I took the money and I never went back to storm chasing. I can hardly stand the rain. When it beats on my windows at night, I am only reminded of the colors on my screen that shook me to my core so many years ago. I'll never know what was on that island, and I'm fine with that. I'm not sure if I really want to know. I love to beta test games. Watching something being built and helping creators with feedback is one of my favorite ways to pass the time. When I got an email saying I was accepted to test a game called IRL Vancouver, I was ecstatic. I don't remember signing up for it, but I'm always on sites like Kickstarter, so I assumed it just slipped my mind. The email described it as an open-world, real-life simulator set in Vancouver. The quotations around simulator seemed strange, but I assumed that English wasn't the developer's native language and I glossed over it. The game was attached as a zip file to my email, which was definitely not normal. A quick antivirus scan and a 3.2 gigabyte file eased my worries. However, and I went ahead and installed it. A plain white loading screen filled my monitor with a tip in the middle. Remember to train IRL before hunting the pariah. Being new, I had no idea what that meant, but I was excited at the prospect of multiplayer. The game finished loading and I was presented with a black screen. After a few seconds of confusion, I realized I was in a dark room and I had to wait for my character's pupils to adjust to it. That was honestly a pretty impressive start to a real-life simulator. But I would have liked to create my own character. I got out of the bed I was in, trying to avoid waking my wife, and made my way into the kitchen, taking a moment to inspect the minimal HUD. No health bar, just an outline of a man to show where the pain would be. A purple cloud in my stomach showed that I was hungry, and a light yellow one a little lower let me know that I had to pee. Other than that, nothing else was on the screen to help me besides a tooltip in the top corner that said, "Press B for biography." I hit B and a 40-page biography appeared over the game. It was literally a full life story detailing his hopes, dreams, friends, hobbies, even his minor drug problem. After a quick scan, I felt like I knew Kevin MacLeod better than I knew myself. I flicked the light on, and my breath was taken away by the impossible level of detail. If a screenshot was shown to me, I would argue that it was a lie and just a photograph of a kitchen. I took a look in the fridge and, on noticing milk and eggs, a memory explaining on how to bake a cake popped up in a little translucent box. I figured this was a good tutorial as of any, and the controls were very complicated, so I took the chance to learn what I'm doing. Trying to get the flour out of the pantry, I misjudged the weight and dropped it, shooting flour across the kitchen with a loud bang. I heard movement coming from the bedroom, and Kevin's very upset wife, Tracy, stomped out, tying up her robe as she scolded me. "Are you kidding me? It's 3 in the goddamn morning. What the hell are you doing?" No text box came up, but I got an idea and put my mic on. Hello? Hi, hello, answer the question. I nearly fell out of my chair. Voice recognition and NPCs is unheard of, especially in beta. So I decided to have a little fun with it. "I'm making a cake, Bessie. Got any milk for me, or should I use the jug, my bovine beauty?" Then I beamed her in the forehead with an egg. She shrieked like a banshee and ran back into the room, screaming about divorce and how I'm back on drugs while she packed a suitcase. On her way out, I chased her through the yard, peeing on her heels and in the car as she got in before she backed out of the driveway, and spinning the tires as she took off down the street. 15 minutes later, I realized cooking was done in real time, so I decided to call it a night and check again in the morning. The next afternoon, I loaded the game up again. To my surprise, I wasn't Kevin, but a doctor in the middle of performing a surgery. As I ran through Dr. Tamika LaChance's bio, the nurse in the room started asking if I was okay. I realized this game doesn't pause, so I apologized, trusting the tooltips, and I dove into the procedure. 20 minutes later, the patient had passed away, so I did what any gamer would do in this situation. I hopped up on the table and proceeded to teabag the corpse. The nurses obviously didn't take kindly to this, so I spent the next 7 or 8 minutes fighting them off until security showed up and pepper sprayed me. The next week went pretty much the same, even playthrough was somewhat completely different. I drove through Vancouver like a maniac, punching hobos, stealing old people's canes and walkers, that kind of thing. I was feeling pretty confident in my abilities, so I decided it was time to hunt this pariah. I asked myself where to find them, but the mic picked up the question and a GPS arrow appeared. It's not much of a hunt if they direct me, but I figured with such a huge map, this was just for ease of use. About an hour later, with the cops on my tails after running over a couple people on my way there, I pulled into the alley, pointed out by the arrow. I made my character, an amateur bodybuilder named Nathan Struthers, get out of the car and maneuver around the dumpsters blocking the entrance just as the police showed up behind me. I rushed around the corner to confront this guy, but I was stunned by what I saw. I expected a boss battle or some kind of duel, but instead I was greeted by 3 dead bodies and a man cowering in the corner, crying. I heard the cops closing in, so I snapped back to reality and moved quickly to this guy. He was muttering to himself, "It's not a game. It's not a game," until my large hand gripped his throat and pinned him to the ground. For a moment, I felt legitimate remorse. The look on his face was of mind-breaking fear, but he made no attempt to fight back. I never actually wanted to show mercy to an NPC before, but I felt like he had the information I wanted. Unfortunately, the cops turned the corner and yelled at me to stop, so I took the chance while I had it. I gripped his trachea and pulled. Just as the gore started to pour out, however, the screen went black and began to show me my stats. People killed, 78. People injured, 217. Lives ruined, 503. Acts of compassion, 2. People saved, 0. Brutality, 7.5 out of 10. A message appeared on the screen. "Thank you for playing IRL Vancouver. Unfortunately, your acts of aggression have qualified you to become the next pariah. Good luck." The game shut itself down after that, and an error message came up whenever I tried to restart it. I was pretty upset that I never got to be the pariah, but it was late at that point, so I decided I'd screw with the files the next day. I woke up around 9 and went into the living room to watch the news when I ate my breakfast. As usual. When I saw the headline, "Local bodybuilder brutally murders man, claims amnesia," I nearly choked on my Fruit Loops. A mugshot from my character last night shared the screen with a picture of the pariah, smiling happily with his family at Disneyland. This happened yesterday, and since then I've had 3 people try to kill me. Each with the same expressionless face, uncaring as I try to explain what happens if they kill me. At this point, I don't think I can keep up with this for long. I killed 78 people, ruining over 500 lives, 78 daughters, fathers, sisters, and grandparents. Whether I knew what I was doing or not, the weight on my conscience is debilitating and I can't live with myself. If you're playing IRL, please, be a good person. Help those in need. Protect the weak. Show compassion for your fellow men, and when you're convinced you've made the city a better place, please come kill me. Hello there. I hope that finding this would be helpful in some way. I am writing this to share my story of a lost soul trapped in an endless nightmare that only gets more dreadful as time passes, and I hope that no one else will share the same experience. It's been so long since this has happened, so pardon me for the lack of details. Anyway, this is a story to tell you of my fateful encounter with an unknown being. No, it's not a poltergeist or some specter, but I suppose the closest description would be a god. Unfortunately, I was unable to understand his name, so I only refer to him as UB, or Unknown Being, from here on. I met him during a time where I decided to take my own life, and although most of the events happened too long ago, this part was etched in my mind too deeply to be forgotten. I looked at my phone for one last time. August 7th, 2016, 4:18 a.m. I took a deep breath and sighed as I prepared myself to cross to the other side of consciousness, assuming death itself is a transition between two states of consciousness. I had the noose wrapped tightly around my neck and was ready to give the stool a kick when, suddenly, I noticed a pristine white envelope lying on the table. I was aware that if I just got over with my plan, it wouldn't bother in the long run, but something inside of me, as if my soul was screaming, compelled me to open the envelope. So I took off the noose and checked all over the envelope. It was pure white with nothing written on it, and I broke the seal to take out a folded note which said, "Would you like to start a new journey with slight changes?" Before I had any time to process what was happening or who sent me this letter, even why I was receiving this letter, my eyes were seared with a sudden white light. Upon regaining my vision, I was in an unknown space where white stretched as far as the eye can see. Though the place was unknown and lonely, I felt comfortable and at peace with the silence. As if someone was reading my mind and wished to break my tranquility, a large hand tapped on my shoulder. As I looked back, I was greeted by a middle-aged man in a tuxedo, smiling at me. As soon as our eyes met, he immediately asked, "Do you know the reason why you're here, boy?" "Well, no, sir." I tried saying some more, but there were no words to speak. To this, he gave me a smug laugh and replied, "Alright, let me introduce myself. I am God, and you are here because I specifically chose you to go over your life once more. But you will retain your memories and knowledge from your past life. Although you have to remember that there are some things in life you can't really change, even with your retained memories. Now you shall go, and complete your life as you please." Yubi's voice reverberated throughout my head as my vision blurred and eventually faded as I was transported back to Earth. As I grew up, I was able to become the person I always wanted to be. Life had never been better, and I was always looking forward to the next day, unfolding it the way I wanted it. Finally, I understood what a walk in the park meant. Oh, and Yubi was also there for me. He didn't help me directly, but he was kind of a good friend that I could always talk to. Since he was kind of like a god, I was able to converse with him telepathically, so it didn't really look strange when I spoke to him in public. By the end of high school, I was pretty much friends with most people, and I was quite skilled at writing, just the way I wanted to grow up. For college, I decided to take computer science just like during my past life. I wanted to prove to myself that I would be able to get through it without failing this time around. I guess having some base knowledge about what I'll be facing is kind of cheating, but hey, life isn't fair, so why should I play by the rules? Toward the final weeks of my second year in college, my friend brought me to a party. I wasn't really the type of person to go to these kinds of events, but he was a friend I found difficulty declining. There we sat, in a table at the corner of the room. I was pretty bored and I was just reading a book on my phone. I wasn't sure what my friend was doing, but he eventually called out to someone behind me. She came over and my friend introduced me to her. Her bright eyes looked at mine intently as my friend beckoned her. Her name was Christine, and she studied at a university one town away from mine. Initially, I was pretty nervous as I wasn't comfortable speaking with strangers, especially when we had nothing in common, but she made me feel comfortable as we spoke, and her charming looks just captivated me. She had long brown hair tied in the back in a ponytail, draping down at her back. She had dark, black eyes which had a gaze that took you to another world. It was irresistible, and the way her soft pink lips moved as she spoke only furthered my infatuation. It was starting to get late, so I decided to walk Christine all the way back to her home. Thankfully, we did get there safely, and I immediately went home, all giddy and excited. When I got home, I immediately texted her asking how she was, and we just continued on and on. Just as the start of a new day brings end to darkness, our conversation was brought to an end by the dawn of a budding sweet relationship. After 2 years, I had successfully graduated and earned my degree, and I had UB to thank. Christine and I kept in touch, and although we walked down different paths after college, we always spent time chatting with each other on the internet when time permitted us. Eventually, we got to know each other's families, and sometimes I'd have her stay over at my family's house for dinner. Although it was more often that I was the one coming over to her place since she was an only child and her parents wanted to spend time with her on the Saturday nights. We also took jobs in the same city, so although work life was more difficult and complicated than college life, we at least got to meet one another after the day's end. On Christine's 26th birthday, I decided to leave work early and surprise her with a fairly expensive dinner. I was a bit short on cash that night, so I had to withdraw some money from the nearby ATM. Around 4:10 p.m., I went to a cafe that was located conveniently across Christine's workplace. That way, I could kill some time by browsing the internet and be able to notice when she exited her building. I waited around 2 hours before she got out, and I quickly packed up my laptop and rushed to greet her. Just as she smiled when she saw me, 2 men wearing tuxedos from both sides ran towards me and started firing shots. I dropped to the ground, unable to support my body with a sharp pain resonating all over. I worried that they might hurt Christine as well, but they just ran away. Whoever they were, I was a bit relieved that I was their only target. After a brief moment, my breathing became heavier and I eventually lost consciousness. When I woke up, UB was staring at me with the same smug smile he had before. I had a hunch that he was somehow involved, considering the men donned the same suit that he had. Without thinking about anything else, I immediately asked, "Those men, you're connected to them somehow, aren't you?" I'd be lying if I said no, so yes, I did send them. But why? What for? I thought you were on my side. I was just having the time of my life. Okay, boy, look. I'm on no one's side. I'm not your friend or your ally or anything. You're even lucky I gave you a chance to redo your entire life, with perks to top it off. So, what now? Are you going to finally seal my soul somewhere and lock me up for eternity? No. Actually, you get a third life, and a fourth, and a fifth, and so on. With the accumulated knowledge, you should eventually get the hang of it, right? Well, off you go. Before I could even protest or comment, there I was, crying as an infant and beginning my third incarnation. Just as my second life, I went through school and college with minimal difficulty. In this incarnation, I also met Christine. It seemed as though my memory retainment was exclusive to me, so I had to rebuild our relationship and replay our conversations. I'd hate to admit it, but this time around it stung me inside a bit. The memories you shared, the laughs, the tears, everything was gone. Nonetheless, I made it my goal in this life to keep her safe so we could live a normal life together. To cut the long story short, we were pretty much in the clear now, or so I thought until the night that I died the last lifetime reoccurred. This time, it was slightly different though. I waited in the cafe, browsing the internet, and when Christine was outside the building, I rushed to her, but I looked both left and right. Thankfully, there were no suspicious people around. We got to the car and we were heading towards the restaurant to celebrate her birthday. Just as I reached the last turn before the street of the restaurant, our large truck speeded head-on directly towards us. During the impact, I lost consciousness for a short while, but eventually sprang back to check on Christine. Blood smeared throughout her forehead from where she was hit. She was unconscious, and I immediately called for an ambulance. By the time we reached the hospital, she was pronounced dead. The emptiness haunted me. I stared at her cold corpse, recalling the events that led to this tragedy. Regret and anger smothered all other thoughts. If only I had capitalized on the small window to turn and weaken the impact. If only I had chosen to do things differently. When I got home, it was around 10 p.m. The bed we used to share felt too big to me. Our apartment wasn't really the largest, and we used to think it was pretty small, but having all this space to myself made me feel like I owned an endless field, nothing but the howling wind to accompany me. Around midnight, I got up and went to the nearest train station. I was just too tired to do anything else. As the train approached, at a swift speed, I jumped to meet the train, leading to a painless death. At this point, I'm not even surprised anymore. UB was a traitor, and I despised him so much for that. I despised myself even more for believing that his little game would eventually grant me joy. UB had that same smug smile when I first met him. I let him do all his talking about accumulating knowledge and getting through life. He didn't seem to care about how I felt, so he didn't say much after that, and simply repeated my life for the 4th time. This time, I died again during Christine's birthday. Some undetected disease apparently working its way over the years that I was unable to tend to. At this point, I was just confused and tired, so I inquired about why it always had to end this way. UB's response filled me with a newfound fury. It was the ire that lasted forever until I got what I wanted. The very reason why, the 5th life onwards, I began doing everything in my power to escape this nonsense. Alright boy, do you really want to know why you keep dying? Do you remember this? He reveals the rope that I was supposed to use to end my life the first time. I replied nothing, so eventually he continued. Yeah? You can look at this rope as a reflection of yourself and the many threads that make it the lives you live. As you can see, all the threads run through the rope independently, but they all have the same end. These threads may be unique to one another, such as there are no 2 threads that are exactly alike. But together they start and together they end as well. No matter how much knowledge you attain and how differently you live one life to another, you will always meet the same end. You were designed to be a tragedy, and you will stay that way no matter what. That is the simple way that I have designed you, and you will continue to do this until you have died in every possible way. So boy, off you go once more. Lifetime after lifetime, death after death, rebirth after rebirth. I've always been trying to save Christine and myself. At this point, I've probably died at least 200 times and I'm pretty damn tired. I've tried to circumvent UB's design by dying in an earlier date before, but it doesn't work. I've also tried poisoning both Christine and I with her consent, but I'm afraid it was to no avail. However, I will continue to attempt escaping this bitter end so long as Christine and I cross paths. With that, I part here now with a simple message. Please remember that all those second chances are a sign of mercy and grace. It is always best to think twice whether it really is better the second time around. Maybe one day I'll be an astronaut. Maybe. As I sat there on my son's bed late that night, I heard him in the kind of limitless ambition that I wish I could have held on to just a few years longer into my adult life. Tucked in his bed as tight as humanly possible, he stared unblinkingly at the glow-in-the-dark plastic stars that enveloped the ceiling above him. I tousled his hair while setting the book we had started reading on his nightstand. And maybe one day we'll get through a chapter in this book. He shifted his head in my direction, giving me a look that indicated he was about to lay down some hard facts. Astronauts never read, Papa. They're too busy flying through space. You don't think they need something to do while they're flying through space? He shook his head vigorously while readjusting his gaze back towards the ceiling. They fly really big spaceships. If they don't pay attention, they'll hit an asteroid and blow up. I couldn't argue with his logic, so I retreated into a soft chuckle as I stood up beside his bed. You win this round, kiddo. Those moments were always special for me as a father. On a normal day, Kevin would rarely speak. Granted, he was 6 and probably a little shy. I think a lot of it was that he was just too busy running around the house at full speed to stop and talk. It was as if God realized he made me too much of a conversationalist and wanted to see what the inverse would be like. When it came to the topic of space exploration, though, everything was flipped. He could sit perfectly still and talk about the various planets in our solar system and how each one was super cool in their own way. If you didn't know, Neptune only has aquatic life in the form of giant turtles. Mars has alien species that come to visit Earth unnoticed all the time, and Jupiter's red spot is actually made out of spaghetti sauce. Imagination was never short in supply with him, so it was always a treat just letting him ramble on about the universe and all of its secrets. Good night, Kev. Night, Papa. Turning off the lamp beside his bed, Kevin was immediately bathed in the sharp green hue of the stars above. Maybe it was the fact that his room was unusually dark being partially underground, but those stars illuminated his entire being with the intensity of a ton of minuscule green flashlights. It was a sight I had gotten used to seeing ever since we put the stars up a couple years back, and one that didn't bother him any, but still, it slightly unsettled me. On this particular night, I decided to spend my remaining hours awake catching up on some work. I was a recruiter at the time for an outreach program that focused on troubled teens, which on my end basically equated to a ton of paperwork and lots of phone calls. I mean, sure, I went to school to be an astronomer, and Kevin always liked hearing what I could contribute to our space conversations, but this recruiter job allowed me to be a stay-at-home dad after his mom left us, so I tried not to complain. It had started to rain outside, with the rumble of distant thunder gently rattling the frame of our old country house. From a single glance, I could tell a pretty significant storm was heading our way, and despite the fact we lived in Tornado Alley, Kevin's room provided an appropriate amount of shelter, so I never spent too much time panicking in the face of Mother Nature. I was prepared to head into his room to hunker down for the storm anyway when he called out, "Papa, a shooting star!" Oh brother, I must have thought. That was probably the third shooting star that he had seen in the last week alone. Kevin had always been the type to do everything in his power to stay awake a little longer than his bedtime, and calling out shooting stars was his go-to move. I had never taken the bait before, but because I needed to go into his room anyway, this was the night I finally decided to acknowledge his sighting. I opened the door and immediately began looking for a good spot to camp out for the night. "Buddy, I'm sure it was just lightning playing tricks on you. Try and go to sleep, okay? I need to be in here to work until the storm blows over." "No, not out there. In here." His clarification was of lesser importance to the plugin that I had just found to charge my laptop. "What do you mean, buddy?" "The shooting star, it's over there." He was pointing at one of the bigger stars on his ceiling. It was glowing as bright as ever, but sitting completely still. I sighed and gave him that classic parenting look that said, "I know what you're doing." "Stop playing around, Kev. Go to sleep and tomorrow—" "No, really, Papa, just watch." That time, I must have sighed at an audible level because Kevin immediately transitioned into begging mode. I put my laptop on the floor beside me and looked up at the star. As it was before, the star stayed in place, casting its green glow directly below him. I kept my gaze affixed on it for what felt like minutes, but it never seemed to. Something moved out of the corner of my eye. "More shooting stars, Papa, I told you." In the opposite quadrant of the room, one of the other stars had begun to slowly move towards the center of the ceiling. It never changed its speed or direction. It was as if the star knew exactly where it wanted to be. Once it reached its destination, the room returned to the stillness from before, as I stared in total disbelief at the plastic universe above me. What? I hadn't finished my thought before another star started sliding in its own set direction. And then another. And then another. The rain continued to rhythmically fall. The thunder rumbled far off in the distance, but the stars moved in total silence. "Oh look, Papa, the Big Dipper. I think that's the Big Dipper." I couldn't look away from the ceiling, as if another star decided to move, I would know why it happened. All of the hairs on the back of my neck were standing at attention, yet fascination had also taken a hold of me. "Scoot over, Kev." He moved over eagerly to the far side of the bed as I climbed in beside him. I was too large to fit in the bed comfortably and too old to believe that being under the covers protected me from the outside world. Nevertheless, here I was. Kevin was pointing towards one of the clusters of stars. "Do you see the Big Dipper too?" Looking back up at the ceiling, I realized I was seeing the world from Kevin's perspective. To say the least, the green glow from the stars was intimidating. It was as if they were all looking right at me to make sure I wouldn't miss their next migration. I averted my gaze to look more closely at what Kevin was pointing at. Normally, I took his knowledge of the universe with a grain of salt, and instead focused on enjoying his imagination. Only this time, he was right. It was the Big Dipper. The stars hadn't formed a look-alike of the famous constellation. It was identical. The layout, the amount of stars that comprise it, everything. I couldn't find a way to confirm within myself that its presence was intentional, but that's what it felt like. Closer to us, I also noticed another formation. The Little Dipper. It was also identical to its real self, but almost perfectly scaled to match its relation to the Big Dipper. They not only fit their individual criteria for look and position, but also the direction they faced in regards to what season it currently was. I was looking at a replica of the nighttime sky, but what was moving the stars in place? Suddenly I was overcome with a feeling of dread. Sweat began to form on my brow and back as I consciously quieted my breathing despite trying to hide it all from Kevin. The green glow from above started to feel more menacing than mesmerizing. We were being watched. "I've never seen so many shooting stars at once, Papa." Kevin was staring in wonderment at the new arrangement above him. He was thoroughly enjoying himself. "Hey, bud, let's go stay in my room tonight." But the storm has come." I know, but we need to get..." I had turned to pull the covers off of Kevin when my arm brushed up against a hard invisible object over top of him. And then for a brief moment, it became visible. On all fours, a tall humanoid creature was straddling and looming over Kevin's blanket-wrapped figure. Its eyes were jet black, and its hairless body was covered in a bright white skin highlighted only by the neon green of the stars above. Staring intently at Kevin, it let out a sharp hiss that dwarfed any of the ambient sounds from the outside storm. Then as quickly as it appeared, it vanished from sight. Kevin didn't scream or say a word, but he had turned a shade of pale that almost mirrored the creature above him. I didn't say anything at first either, but I wasted little time aggressively swatting the air over where the creature was to get it away from my son. The thing had already moved. The last thing I wanted to do was anything other than lay there petrified with Kevin, but I knew that wasn't an option. Cradling him in my arms, I quickly got us out of the bed and fled the room. I'd been living in that house for a few years by that point, but everything about what just happened made our surroundings feel alien. The rooms felt bigger, the hallways seemed longer, and everything that once made that house feel safe was suddenly oppressive. Nevertheless, I pressed on to our storage room. I had a gun safe in there, and at the time, grabbing a gun before fleeing seemed like the best option. Kevin still hadn't said a word, but his mouth was wide open as if he was trying to scream. Paralysis had taken over him. I sat down beside him as I began to frantically fumble the combination of my gun safe at the back of the storage room. My palms were sweating all over the dial, and my hand was trembling to the point that opening the safe was much more of a difficult task than I anticipated. I tried several times to open it, but to no avail. "Come on!" I tried once more. The door still wouldn't budge. After I gave the safe a final punch, I gave up and turned around to grab Kevin and flee, but immediately froze. Floating a good 3 feet off the ground, Kevin hung in place by the middle of his shirt. I couldn't see the creature, but by the height and the way my son was grabbed, it was standing on its 2 hind feet. Kevin's helpless body was then rushed out of the room at an inhuman speed, causing his body to shake around like a rag doll. Kevin never screamed, and the creature moved in complete silence. "No!" I sprinted after it with all my remaining strength I had within me, but I only made it halfway down the hallway to the living room before running into an invisible object. A large, white hand quickly faded into existence around my face. Before I had time to register that it was another one of those creatures, it lifted me off the ground in its grip and then threw me to the floor with incredible force. My head took the initial impact and I was knocked unconscious. A severe headache and some blurry vision were what I awoke to. I probably suffered a concussion, but that was the least of my worries at this point. I didn't get very far in my panic search for Kevin before I realized the front door was open. If he was screaming, I couldn't hear it. Kevin and his kidnappers were long gone. It's been 3 years since that night. 3 years since I've seen my son. The weeks following the encounter, I spent searching everywhere in the nearby area with the help of the local police as well as the police of neighboring towns. I ended up losing my job and I sold my home to move back in with my parents. This has at least allowed me to conduct more independent searches as well as try to find information as what exactly those things were that took my son. I wouldn't be surprised if there are more out there than just the 2 that were in my house. Perhaps even a lot more. You can't see them or hear them unless you make physical contact. That seems to be the only way they like it. Kevin had seen shooting stars for months, which makes me think they were observing him that whole time. Who knows if they would have taken him if I had not blown their cover. As I sit here writing this story for you, I am under the light of hundreds of plastic stars. I put them up at my parents' house on the simple hope that I see one of the stars starting to freely move across the ceiling. Something about those stars fascinated them like Kevin. Their ability to correctly position the stars had been something that puzzled me deeply. Maybe the creatures aren't from Earth at all. Maybe Kevin is an astronaut now. Maybe. I'll be blunt. I went to India to kill myself. In a way, I got my wish. Life had become a bleak and gray thing that looked to be a prison woven out of countless invisible strands. Money, cubicle, bad food, bad sleep. I was 2 years out of college and seeing the rest of my years flowing straight ahead with no deviation and no freedom. Raised on video games and television, I was now expected to suddenly fit into a drone-like routine. Wake up far earlier than I ever had to before. Sit at work, going crazy from the boredom for 9 hours. Then drive home to eat, sleep, and do it all over again. Was this really life? I held out for another year before I knew I couldn't do it anymore. I couldn't be a cog in the machine. But our world is not kind to young men who refuse the system. Every day on the way to work, I saw homeless people and how they were treated. I wouldn't go out like that. No, that was just a slow suicide all on its own. I'd always been fascinated by television shows about other countries, so I chose my favorite and I spent the remainder of my bank account on a ticket to India. Once I got there, once I had seen all the wonderful sights and experienced another culture, well, there was nothing after that. No plans, and once you're out of money, you're as good as dead anyway. It turned out India wasn't much different than home. There were coffee shops, crowded streets, jobs, the same bitter meal, and just a slightly different scent and flavor. It shouldn't have been like that. It was supposed to be different. Another continent, but it was the same prison. I begged for change until I got enough to buy a bottle of sleeping pills. They weren't even that expensive, but the experience of asking strangers for money for 2 days straight was enough to convince me I was doing the right thing. I found a corner and I ate them all, a handful at a time. I don't even remember falling asleep. It was as if I had been thrust 1,000 feet deep under the ocean and I was rising. For a time, I thought I was free from my body and soaring up to heaven. But instead, I burst up out of the waters of Lethe and banged my head into wood. A bunk bed? No. My arms were sore and tingly from disuse, but they still listened. My half-numb fingers found a rough surface about 2 inches above my face. It was dark. Why was it dark? And why was it so hard to breathe? I began trying to flex my legs, but they didn't want to move. I managed to curl my toes after some effort, and then the pain in my thighs and ankles seared into my awareness. My legs were bent and must have had poor blood flow for quite some time now. I clenched my fists against the pain and just remained like that until the pain finally passed. After that, I tried to stretch and the truth hit me. I was curled up in a small wooden box. But why and where? I pressed against the sides of the box, but I felt absolutely no give. It was a poor quality wood with very little strength, which meant something had to be blocking it on the other side. And that meant, oh God. The bottle of sleeping pills must have nearly killed me, but not completely. They must have thought I was dead. They buried me alive. I was lucky to even have a box, really. As a foreigner, as somebody with no money, had someone put me inside it as an act of kindness? If they had just thrown me in the pit and buried me, I would have been dead already. The logic didn't seem to help the panic back for more than a few seconds. I began screaming and beating at the thin wood with all my strength. Bits of dirt sifted down from above, but I kept attacking the wood until it began pouring down like the grains in an hourglass. The air was stale and I was suffocating, but I had no better plan. I would either die now or find... Yes! They hadn't buried me deep at all. Maybe a few inches. Sunlight. I could see sunlight. And air. Air flowed in. Oh my God. The sweetest breath despite the choking dirt in the air. I screamed for help. But there was no reply. Was I in some sort of graveyard? Of course, I had to be. My shout had to be in reality a small whimper, but nobody would ever hear it. I waited, and didn't hear anyone. Every so often, I would shout as loud as I could. The light outside dimmed and went dark, and then reappeared over the course of a cold night. That morning, it began to rain. A little bit of water trickled down, and I drank as much as I possibly could. The box creaked as the dirt above grew heavier, and I was forced to roll onto my back and prop up the weak roof with my knees. I wasn't strong enough to bash my way up, but it could certainly fall in on me and crush me if I didn't do this. How do I convey what it's like to be buried alive? Every story I've read or movie I've seen focuses on the initial terror of waking up underneath the earth forgotten. That passed quickly. The era after that was an endless one of waiting, thinking, and guessing. Do I shout now? Do I wait? Do I conserve my strength and try to break up through the surface when the dirt dries out? I hope it doesn't rain so the earth will dry, but I hope it does rain so I won't die of thirst. But I also hope it doesn't rain too hard or I'll drown. And always, 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 the box is present, like part of your body. No matter what position you choose, you can feel every single side of it. It's right there with you, like a shell, like a second skin. You come to know every knot and grain in the dark. You even repair it and prop it up with your own strength, even though it's the damn thing that you were trapped inside. The box is death, but the box is also life. For 2 days, it didn't rain. Then, right about noon, judging by the initial brightness of my sole beam of light, a new darkness joined me in the box. I thought someone had walked over my grave and I began to shout, but no, it was a thunderstorm. I prayed, you bet I prayed. I'd never been a religious guy before, but please, please, I said, please keep this rain to a light drizzle. When an inch of water had built up around me in the box, I knew it was time to act. It was do or die. I practiced a pose worthy of Circus Olay, and I got into it now. Bare feet planted solidly in that inch of water, knees out, arms curled under, back against the ceiling. All inside a box about 2 feet high. I pushed. The wood cut into my back, but I pressed with all the strength left in my legs. There was a small give above, as if I was making a little bump in the dirt where some person might see it. I strained so hard, I put so much of myself into that attempt that I felt nothing else. I envisioned myself bursting free into the open air and rain, and that's all I had to do. My body gave out first, and I rolled onto my back to rest for a second try. Something up there had moved. I knew I could do it, given time. But the box betrayed me, and it caved in on top of me. Dirt poured in as I fruitlessly fought the flow. I put my mouth to a narrow air hole in an attempt to avoid suffocation. All that did was leave me completely trapped and totally unable to move while wet dirt squeezed in over my eyes and around my neck. I was entirely encased in dirt except for my mouth, which was open to the air, and the rain was intensifying. I drank as much rainwater as I could. I even began eating the traces of mud it brought down with it. Anything I could do to keep that narrow hole in the ground above clear. Eventually, though, the rain overtook me and I was forced to close my mouth and hold my breath. That was it then. There were no more plays, no more tries. I'd come to India to die, even tried to kill myself with pills, and yet here I was, fighting desperately down to the very last second, just to cling to my life for one moment longer. I was immobile underground, with a funnel of rainwater growing heavier on my closed mouth. How long could Olympic divers hold their breath? I'd seen a show once, while flipping through the channels. Was it 3 minutes? Was it 4? God, the pressure in my chest. I hadn't even gotten a full breath. 60, 61, 62, 63. I knew I was nearing my limit. What did I want to spend the last minute or two of my life thinking about? Girls I dated? My favorite movies? It was all nothing, but it was everything. Every mundane little thing in the entire world was now a luxury I would never have again. I would stroke the fabric of my cubicle at my boring job if only to see again, to breathe one more time. Thunder struck overhead so loud that I could hear it even in my prison of mud. I wish I could say that at the last moment the hillside gave way under the fury of the monsoon and spilled me onto a mudslide of corpses. That's what local law enforcement and doctors insisted on when I tried to tell them the truth. To them, I was just a crazy foreigner that had been traumatized by being buried alive. They refused to listen. Because I was not saved at the last second by the weather. In fact, I wasn't saved at all. I counted to 140 before my awareness started to halo out into a shimmering white. Keep my mouth closed. Keep my mouth closed. Keep my mouth closed. Water, dirt, mud, pressure. Keep my mouth closed. That was all that remained. If you open your mouth, you die. But if you don't breathe, you also die. No choices. Something was tugging at me just before I gave in. Something was pulling at me, not from above, but from below. Chilliness wrapped around my limbs and began to pull me down. I remember the spray of released rainwater as I shot down from the hole where it built up. Then I was dragged through the earth at a breakneck pace. Keep your mouth shut. Keep your mouth shut. No longer. I let out dead air and I gasped. Somehow I was alive. I'd been deposited somewhere full of soft round lumps and hard straight lines. The air here was breathable, but it was horribly foul. For as much as I wanted to escape the darkness, I let myself just be alive for a few minutes. I think I knew something was wrong, but it wouldn't begin until I opened my eyes. Finally, I was fully conscious again. Still dark, no light. I began to crawl across the piles. Long solid objects clacked against one another. Big round soft lumps rolled as I pushed my way across. As I went, I began to suspect, but I didn't truly know until my hand fell upon the unmistakable lay of a cold nose and mouth. The human head rolled away down the pile of bones I was crawling over. I saw nothing, but I knew what it was. Had the graveyard somehow rotted underneath? Had rainwater deposited all the bodies down in some sort of cave? I was alive, at least for the moment, but this was somehow worse than the box. At least in the box I could shout and pray someone would hear me. If I was in a corpse-filled sinkhole, well, there was nothing to do but starve. A fate which would take years if new bodies were continuously sliding down whenever it rained. God, what if I never died? What if enough water and human meat made it down here to keep me alive for decades? Could I really eat a corpse? It's funny, I hadn't actually cried while I was in the box. In that box, everything was so simple. But here, it's loneliness and starvation which could turn me into a monster. I crawled around that sinkhole for hours, testing each side of the massive pit. The sides were solid dirt and packed in hard by the ancient geological processes. There was a small span of time where I considered building some sort of scaffolding out of bones. There was certainly enough, and there were tons of clothes and hair that I could tie them off with. It was a grim thought, but seemingly the only way out. Until the door opened. There was no light, and I only heard it. In that sinkhole, there were only two sounds. The water draining away into a narrow crack between two hard plates of rock, and me. After at least 2 days down there, I knew the moment the door opened. It was nothing but a soft sigh of smooth metal and warm air, but I began moving toward it immediately. There was also a forced sound. Something moved among the pile of bodies, sending bones scattering and heads rolling. It was swift and mostly silent, and it dragged something back out. I chased after it and dove into the gap that hadn't been there before. I got inside before it closed. Metal. Warm metal. It was still pitch black out, but I could feel the smooth, warm metal under my hands. A maintenance shaft, I guessed? But for what? Had some animal found a grate in the sewers and given me my escape? I felt behind me, but the door was solid metal. Not a grate and covered with unfamiliar sleek patterns. Checking, I found that I could push it open if I wanted to. It opened only from the inside, and I'd somehow missed it while feeling the sides of the sinkhole. I could go back if I wanted to, but to hell with that. I turned and I started to crawl ahead. There was really no way to tell how long this warm and smooth metal tunnel was. I'd been in darkness so long that I'd lost all sense of distance and time. I crawled until my hands and feet were too weak to move, and then I slumped along on my elbows and knees. This was going somewhere. This had to be going somewhere. I slept encased in warmth when I put my head to a soft round hump of metal. I could hear the rising and falling humming, as if everything around me was alive, asleep and breathing softly somewhere deep and distant. How long had I been underground by then? A week? For the first time in a week, I found light. When I awoke and I kept crawling on my sore hands, I finally emerged into an open chamber that held its own dim gray ambient glow. As happy as I was to finally see again, and even then, only the barest unknown darkness that any normal human eye would have seen in pitch black, had they not spent a week underground craving light. I also knew I was not nearly home or safe. Here, the sleek metal tombs of the tunnel expanded to form a sort of rectangular mortuary. There were no floor, only a maze of pipes overlapping one another. The pipes bulged upwards and places in a series of table-like formations. On these knotted biers rested 6 corpses in various stages of decay. 2 of the tables were empty. Yeah, from bad to worse. But my time buried alive had beaten all the fear out of me. Death was no longer the worst possible outcome, and I had to keep going. The chamber had multiple ways out, and none of them looked official. I crawled up into the pipe-lined hole and hid there as I heard something sighing outside a large gap. As I squeezed myself tighter and tighter into shadow, I watched an enormous organic metallic hand on 1,000 joints slide in without a sound and pick up the farthest corpse in the row. From the sound, I knew that this was the thing that had entered the sinkhole. This is what had stolen a corpse. This had reached all the way down that interminable tunnel on its endless metal-jointed arm. And now it was taking one of the bodies to another chamber. Creeping by the dim ambient glow, I moved down the subtly pulsing tunnel beyond, following the arm as it receded into gloom. It was dangerous, and my heart threatened to pound through my ribcage, but I had nowhere else to go. I only barely caught my breath as I came face to face with a human skull. I nearly screamed. Set in the wall. No, it was part of the wall. It gaped with open eyes at nothing. Tubes of a dozen different varieties, all smooth chrome, had entered it through the ears and mouth and spinal cord area. The ends of those connections gleamed as spikes in fluid carriers. Had they once connected to something? Moving on, I followed the curve of the wide metallic cave until it reached what looked like the twin operating rooms. A steel bush of microarms hovered over a pipe bulge bare within each room, picking and clawing at a corpse on each table. Wait, no, it wasn't picking at it. I crept closer, wary of that greater arm that had deposited the left body and then departed somewhere. The body on the left table was long decayed, but tiny claws and surgical instruments on arms between 6 and 10 feet long appeared to be dipping into a wide bath in the floor. It was filled with random pieces of human flesh and then carefully applying those pieces to the skull of the dead patient. I slipped and tumbled into the room, nearly sliding into the vat of flesh, but gripped warm metal at the last second. Had I been caught? No. The surgical arms never even so much as slowed. They didn't care about me at all. I hugged the wall, knowing the same might not be true for that bigger arm. As I watched, the arms reconstructed the face of the human being. They did not rebuild his hair or skin, only the muscles around his skull, and then 2 eyes were plucked from the vat and inserted with great care. For the first time since I'd been buried alive, I felt vaguely not alone. Although the eyes just stared straight up, they had no eyelids and, as yet, no muscles to move them. What were these machines doing? The arms began filling the inner portions of the skull where I could not see. Then they flittered quickly down the table, piercing together a spine and the core of a nervous system. Between the ribs, the next things they fused together were 2 different lung sacs from the vat. A small arc of electricity shocked the heart placed in between them. The head, lungs, heart, and ribcage on the table began screaming. Loud echoes of terror and shock radiated out from our organic metal surgery room. I froze in absolute terror for an eternal moment, and then I jumped forward. I hissed, "Shut up, it'll hear you." The muscle-bound skull could not move, but the eyes sitting within did. Ever so slowly, those irises focused on me. Its windpipe moved visibly between its skull and septum. Its lungs contracted with effort, and it said something in Hindu. I put a finger to my lips. Shh. The reanimated half-body said one more sentence in Hindu, then it closed its jutting jaw to signal that I would remain silent. Was it a man or a woman? What had it said? It watched me sidelong with terrified eyes as I climbed into another operating room. The same thing was happening there, but the process was not far along. The machines here were pulling from the vat filled with bone fragments and rebuilding a spinal column below a cracked skull. I must have rocked back and forth for a solid minute as insanity of what I was seeing overwhelmed me. What the hell was this? I must have gone insane. I was still in that sinkhole. No. Whenever I turned and looked over my shoulder, I could see those horrified muscle-ringed eyes watching me, hoping I would do something. The surgical arms continued their work, adding more nerves and pieces of a circulatory system. The arms had seen fit to ignore me so far, but it was too dangerous to interfere with their work. To that man or woman on the table, I whispered, "I'll come back for you." I waited for a nod and I listened to a third sentence in Hindu, and then I headed on. I repeated the foreign syllables in my mind, hoping to memorize them and translate them later if I ever saw civilization again. Who knew what terrible secrets the reanimated man or woman had seen? The curve had continued, taking me through a cathedral-like area where pools of black water stank under a ribcage of thick metal bones dripping ichor from ancient tubing. The light here was still barely perceivable and so thin that I had to move my head back and forth to make out shapes. But it was definitely shifting from gray to blue as I climbed across the vast valley. At no place and no junction were there ever signs, text, or floors to stand on. Nothing about this place was for humans. I wasn't even sure if I was on the bottom, per se, as there were no difference between floors and the ceiling, or indeed, even the walls. The whole place could have been upside down or at an angle for all I knew. There was no intended orientation at all, and it all had grown haphazardly. Because grown had to be the right word. The metal conduits were warm and alive, and I couldn't find a single seam or welding mark. Perhaps a cave system had already existed here and a horrible seed of some sort had grown to fill it over the centuries. Or perhaps I was inside an enormous demon skull even now as I slept inside the earth and this was simply its body. The world was farce and this defied everything I'd ever known. Legs. The next vast chamber held hundreds of pairs of human legs jutting from the walls. Not for me. This chamber was not for me. It was too much. The mind cannot face some things. I climbed upwards, ever upwards, deeper into blue light. At the apex, the most excruciating dark blue light somehow sharp and dull at the same time. I found an oval room hosting a dozen odd dark devices and a face set in the wall at the end. It was the face of a woman and her eyes were closed. Tubes and conduits connected to her bulging head as I'd seen in that skull before, and my mind began to grasp something about the nature of this place. Aging, growth, change. I couldn't explain it in words, but the dark spirit behind those closed eyes. I knew that if she happened to wake and look my way, I would suffer a fate 10,000 times worse than death. The next ramp laid behind her. Moving as slowly and quietly as I could, I stepped from one round pipe to the next, my gaze jumping from my bare feet to her closed eyes twice a second. When I saw her twitched, I moved. Her lids opened slowly, and I saw her eyes move gently back and forth, sweeping the room. She did not see me. I was clinging to the wall below, staring directly up at her chin. Her mouth did not open, but I thought I could hear a hum of suspicion. I counted out 2 hours after her lids had closed again before I crept along the base of the wall and up the ramp. Blue shifted to violet as I ascended. I kept going up and up and up, climbing pipes and avoiding things, and always staying quiet. There was a sleeping awareness about this whole place. A towering, monstrous machine waiting for ages, running pieces of itself on automatic in the meantime, but ever wary of intruders. And I found it there in the violet basilica, when the light became so painfully violet that I knew human eyes had never seen this place. I found a sleeping giant. It was mostly fetus, but mostly brain. It was maybe 10 or 15 times as tall as me, and it was floating suspended in dark ichor inside a glass tube that ran from a biomedical base right to the ceiling, unfathomably high above. As I stared in utmost horror and tried to comprehend it, as I watched its brain stomach expand and contract slowly as it breathed from thick tubes, I saw that it was just one of a dozen. Like massive pillars and double colonnades, I stood at the center of the giant cathedral built to worship and house horrific sleeping beings. I stood in the center, in a circle of pipes, and for the first time, I recognized the use of the space. If they had been awake, those 12s would have floated into their foul chambers and gazed down upon me in judgment. This was a court of some inhuman exotic law, and we had all just been judged guilty. I ran. I no longer cared about being quiet. My bare feet hammered along those uneven round conduits until I was through the basilica and beyond into darkness, where I was sure light still glimmered, but past violet, beyond what human eyes could see. I just kept climbing, hour after hour, sometimes up and sometimes down. And then I climbed up through a narrow tube, barely big enough for me to squeeze through, and I found myself back in the left operating chamber. Somehow I had gotten turned around and that had come full circle. That and I was on the ceiling now. Ports and biomechanical adaptations had been fitted to the ribcage on the operating table above, and skin had been grafted on and was now being fused together by medical lasers. I could now see that it was a woman, and she was staring up at me, both in confusion that I was on the ceiling and that I had returned. I had been right about the lack of an orientation in this horrible place. Could it? Yes, I had climbed up the wall and I felt my sense of direction adapt as I went. The entire time I could have been walking on the walls or ceilings without knowing it. I had simply never tried to circle the chamber's sides rather than climb along the bottom as I understood it. The question it left me was simply, where the hell was I? And there was no escape except back to the single from where I came. I sat for a time with that Hindu woman, but we didn't know each other's language, so all we could do was just sit there and wait and pray. The larger claw soared by at regular intervals. I watched its arm twist and move as it worked farther on down the line, and I guessed that there were other operating rooms and likely other graveyards being pilfered from below. This was death. This was the afterlife for all intents and purposes. We put our dead in the ground and this place took them and rebuilt them for their own ends. There was nothing I could do. Although the table in the right chamber was rebuilding an entire skeleton, the Hindu woman near me only had her top half remade. Half biomechanical, half organic. She struggled as the large arm came to claim her. She screamed, but one of the surgical arms clamped and screwed a metal mask over her mouth, silencing her. I stood unmoving and clutching the walls until the large arm deposited another pile of bones and left the surgical table to its work. The arm didn't care about me. Nothing here did. A week must have passed while I wandered through those ghastly halls. There was nothing to learn, there was nothing to see, and nothing to figure out. No tools, no exits. I was beginning to starve, but I refused to do it. I refused. even though there were whole vats of flesh just waiting to be eaten. I couldn't, and I wouldn't. The black ichor was water. It was stained water, darkened with something unidentifiable, but it kept me alive. Unable to bear the afterlife any longer, I eventually found a new oval room and I gave myself up. Among the black devices was a woman's face, just like the other blue-lit control room, and I waited for her to open her eyes. When she did, I recognized them. I knew those eyes. She spoke. Her mouth was masked and unmoving, but her voice came from the wall somehow. The words began in Hindu, but transformed into something unintelligible as the connections around her head bulged forcefully. The claw was upon me in moments. Chill, solid fingers wrapped around me, and I recognized the feeling. This claw had taken me down from the box and deposited me into the sinkhole. I was captured, and I expected to, what? Be torn apart? Killed? Become a cog integrated into the machine. Exactly what I had always feared, even before I'd been buried alive. The claw carried me at unnerving speed through blue, gray, and even yellow-lit biomechanical tunnels until darkness shrouded me and a rising sensation gripped my stomach. Finally we hit something hard and I was thrown free in a slurry of mud and water in the grip of a tremendous storm. She'd let me go. Somehow, the woman had used some shred of her human willpower to eject me from the afterlife. I couldn't save her, but she had saved me, at least for the moment. I was free. The odyssey that had begun with my suicide attempt was over, and I was back in the world of the living. I survived the storm and even tried to tell the authorities about what was waiting under the earth and stealing their death, but they all just laughed at me. It was also then that I learned a little bit of Hindu customs and that most Hindus are cremated. Did they suspect this? Did their ancestors somehow know what was going on under the earth and stealing the buried? The graveyard that I was buried alive in was a mix of various peoples and tribes, those who couldn't afford cremation and unclaimed foreigners. It was possible that the storm had wiped the entire thing away like I'd been told, but I suspected that the nightmare beneath had closed its sinkhole because my escape had compromised that particular location. While trying to understand what I had experienced, I translated the Hindu woman's 4 sentences and their meaning. To me, it's worse than anything that I witnessed. She said first, when she'd been just a muscle-bound skull and lungs, "Thank you, thank you." After I begged her to remain silent, she said, "I'm just happy to be able to move again." When I told her that I'd come back for her, she said, "Please don't interfere. I want this." And when I'd finally seen her as a part of that nightmare, as a face set on the wall and gagged for eternity, speaking only through biomechanical means, she'd said, "When we die, we stay where we lie. Our bones, our dust, remain aware for all time. This place is trying to help us. They are trying to help us. Though they do not understand us. We know them. They're angels." But her words became some unknown language after that. I wrote down their phonetic syllables, but they're meaningless as far as anyone, even experts, can tell. And I'm left with the horror of knowledge, the hunting paralysis born of what I've seen and heard, from the mouth of something who had died and been rebuilt. When we die, we stay where we lie. Our bones, our dust, remain aware for all time. Suicide is not the last thing on my mind. We must survive for as long as we can, no matter the cost, each and every single one of us. For death is not the end. No, death is just the start. The beginning of a lonely agony that will never end. Ever end, no matter how badly you want it. I thought being trapped in a box for a few days was bad, but now I know that death is worse. Now I travel from graveyard to graveyard, looking, hoping, begging to find that underground nightmare once more. I beg to be a part of the machine, a part of hell. I would make a deal with the devil, or worse, with those sleeping beings in the violet basilica. Take my flesh, if only so that I may live and breathe in some form. For death is without hope and without peace. Death has no escape and no air holes, no cramped limbs, no shouting for rescue. Death is being buried alive with nothing but your thoughts. Forever. There wasn't much for a young boy to do in my hometown. It was all long stretches of tired-looking strip malls and gated communities for the snowbirds to flock to when autumn set in up north. Very South Florida chic. It was the kind of place where an 8-screen movie theater opening up at the mall was cause for celebration, and high school football games were the big Friday night draws. Wholesome, quaint, and boring. It wouldn't have been so bad if I were more interested in fishing or surfing, the favorite summer pastimes of my friends. But a fear of deep water, or rather what lived in it, and an inability to swim kept me firmly planted on the dry land. My parents preferred it that way. Transplants from New England. They had seen Jaws one too many times and were convinced that a giant shark would gobble me up the moment I stuck a toe in the ocean. So while my friends were off enjoying themselves at the beach, I'd be stuck at home, trying to ignore how miserably hot it was despite our ancient air conditioner thrumming noisily through the vents. I read every book and comic I owned, I went through our entire VHS collection, and I visited the convenience store down the street at least twice a day for ice cream and a soda. It did little to ease the stifling dullness that was my summer existence. My dad was the one who suggested I start going for walks along the trails of a nearby park after I spent an entire dinner complaining about another day wasted at home. "If you're so unhappy, bud, do something about it." "What am I supposed to do there? Get eaten by mosquitoes?" I grumbled. Walking in parks was what old people did while they waited to die. "You're almost 13. I think that's little enough for you to take some initiative and figure it out by yourself," my dad said. "The nature trails are nice. You can take my camera and get some pictures," my mom added helpfully. I huffed and pushed my peas around my plate. An unfortunate youth whose parents just didn't understand his suffering. By the next day, after a few hours of lying around on the couch, I had rethought my stance on walking through the park. After digging my mom's Nikon out of her closet and making sure it had film in it, I slung it around my neck, slapped my baseball cap on, and tugged on my sneakers. The dark clouds building on the horizon barely registered as I wheeled my bike out of the garage. Afternoon storms were a common summertime occurrence, and while they could be fierce, they tended to pass quickly. Heat and humidity wrapped itself around me like a thick, damp blanket the moment I stepped outside. The further I pedaled away from the driveway, the heavier it became until I was almost convinced I should turn around and retreat back into my house, where there was at least a small bit of relief to be had. The only thing that had kept me on course was the sight of the sign welcoming me to the Oak River Park. I'm already here, I might as well get some dumb pictures for my mom, I thought. I left my bike chained to the rack at the entrance and wandered down the sidewalk, over to the empty playground, and then towards the wooded trail that veered into a nature preserve. Signs erected around the entrance, warning hikers to stay on the path and beware of snakes and gators, not to go feed the wildlife, and to pay attention to the weather. A small map marked my location and the winding routes that ran through the preserve. I popped the cap off the camera lens and trekked onwards, trying to convince myself that I was interested in what lay ahead. The woods on either side were a dense tangle of underbrush and palm fronds. Little lizards darted to and fro across the path in front of me, deftly avoiding the webs only visible because of the large yellow and black spiders sitting so still in their centers, that were strung between low-lying branches. It was quiet there, except for the occasional rustle of something skittering in the distance or a bird call overhead. And the air seemed even more still and sticky than it had out in the open. I paused every so often to snap a picture of something I thought looked cool, trying my best to mimic photographers I'd seen in movies and on the TV. I'd crouch low, twist myself this way and that, and I'd even went as far as to lie on my stomach so I could get a photo of a shiny beetle crawling slowly across the ground. I made a game out of it, pretending that I was some kind of wildlife photographer sent out into the wilds of Florida to capture elusive creatures on film. When the first roll of thunder sounded in the distance, I didn't pay any attention to it. The sun was still shining, and I'd figured I'd had plenty of time to book it back home. I continued on, crossing a wooden walkway that stretched over the length of a swampland, and followed a black snake I found until it disappeared beneath a bush. Thunder growled again, closer now, and with it came the warning pitter-patter of raindrops. "Oh man," I groaned, annoyed that the weather had caught up with me so quickly. I hadn't even noticed when the sun was swallowed up by the clouds. In response, the sky opened up and it started to pour. Rain doesn't fall gently in Florida summers, it comes down in buckets, lashing you with heavy winds and casting a gray curtain across the world. The forest that had seemed so warm and unthreatening in the sun was now all dark shadows and looming shapes. I tucked my mom's camera under my shirt to try and keep it dry, but there was no escape from the storm. I ducked my head and turned around, hoping that it would be easy to backtrack to my bike, when the howling wind picked up, almost pushing me from my feet, and I stumbled into a nearby oak tree. As I steadied myself against the trunk, the thunder rumbled, long and loud and all around, and just beneath it, I heard something odd. "No, please!" A woman's voice, panicked and afraid, screamed from the other side of the wide trunk. I froze, one hand still resting on the tree, and listened to the heavy footfalls scrambling through the underbrush. "No!" she screamed again, and it cut through me like ice. Twigs snapped, fallen leaves rustled. The woman started to scream again, but it was cut off sharply. By the way she sucked in a desperate breath, I could only guess she had been punched in the chest. When Tommy Winnigan had hit me, I remember making a similar sound and my ribs ached with a phantom pain. "Please!" I could barely hear her over the rain, so weak and defeated. "Please, no." I huddled against the oak tree, barely breathing, too frightened to move or peek around the trunk, and I hugged my mom's camera tightly to me. The storm raged overhead, and it raged just behind me. Crackling thunder and muffled shrieks, flashes of lightning and thrashing in wet leaves. On and on it went until I had to clap a hand over my mouth to keep my own screams from escaping. Her cries turned to whimpers, and then her whimpers into silence. Footsteps again. The sound of something large and heavy being dragged across the ground. The creak of a rope, bearing a great weight, swinging, back and forth, and back and forth. And then nothing. The storm, as most in Florida do, passed over as abruptly as it had started, and the sun was out again. I stayed crouched and pressed against the oak for a long time, well after the rain had stopped and the path leading back to the park became clear again. I listened carefully, strained my ears, but I didn't hear anything that indicated anyone else was close by. No screams, no footsteps, no creaking rope. I rose on shaky legs, almost unable to support myself, and I inched around to the side of the trunk, telling myself I had to check on the woman, that she needed help and I was the only one around. That thought didn't help, and the fear twisted in my stomach until I felt like I was going to throw up. I counted to 3, and then to 10, and then to 20, and then I forced myself to peer around the trunk of the tree to the other side. I wasn't sure if I was more terrified or relieved when I found absolutely nothing out of the ordinary. I ran all the way back to my bike and I sped home, where I hid in my room until my parents got back from work. I didn't mention the incident to anyone. I thought I was crazy enough without having it reinforced by any adults. For weeks, I let what had happened stew in my brain until the events played themselves out in reoccurring nightmares that had me waking up in a cold sweat. I was at a loss, unsure of how to cope, and exhausted from the sleepless nights. I was on edge and irritable. I took comfort in TV, which was bright and loud and normal. Even when I was home alone, it filled the silence and kept my mind off whatever had happened in the woods. I tried to keep it light, just cartoons and game shows and after-school specials. But sometimes there wouldn't be anything like that on and I'd have to settle. That was why that true crime show was on. I wouldn't normally have left it on, but I was feeling particularly lonely and the narrator, despite the grim subject matter, had a soothing voice. I let it run in the background while I tried to read one of my dad's copies of The Hobbit, hoping the combination of Bilbo's adventures and the TV's sound would drive out my anxiety. Our next story takes us to the idyllic Oak River Park in South Florida, the narrator said in his soothing voice. I stopped reading and shot upright to take a look at the screen, where the welcome sign to the park was just fading from view. I let the book, all but forgotten, slip from my hands to the floor while I grabbed the remote to turn up the TV. Now a peaceful place in a family-oriented community, the narrator continued over footage of the playground and nature trail. But between 1974 and 1976, it was the site of half a dozen grisly murders. An oak tree, one that I was sure I knew, was shown next, and I sank to the floor and scooted forward, like I might miss something by being more than a foot away from the screen. In 1974, 14-year-old Paula Ann Humphrey had vanished on her way home from school during a terrible storm. 4 more would disappear after her, all in the middle of heavy rainfall. The park and nature preserve didn't exist then. It was just a wide, unruly wilderness behind a small town that had few reasons to venture into it. It wasn't even really an area of interest for the police. None of the missing girls had ever been seen anywhere near the woods. It wasn't until a dog emerged, carrying a decayed hand, that attention turned to Oak River. Days were spent cutting past through the dense landscape, following cadaver dogs who guided the police to an oak tree, almost in the very center of what would be the nature preserve. From its branches, the bodies of 5 girls ranging in age from 9 to 20 had been hung. Examinations of all the bodies, which were in various stages of decomposition, revealed that each girl had been sexually assaulted and strangled. Police assumed the hand that had been found by the dog had fallen off after one too many animals had made a meal of the body. The last to die, 20-year-old Rachel Jackson, had only been killed a few days before the discovery. Although bloated and blackened by the heat, a fist-sized bruise was visible on her chest and a broken rib was found beneath it. I thought of the girl I had heard, of how her scream had been cut off and she gasped for air. I remembered the sympathy pain I'd felt in my own chest. The room seemed to tilt slightly and I sat back heavily, trying to keep myself from toppling over completely in my confused shock. The case grew cold quickly and, despite a massive, expensive manhunt, the killer was never found. Without any leads, officials were forced to give up the active case after 18 months. Attempts to cut down the oak, dubbed the Hangman's tree, were futile, as chainsaws and axes mysteriously broke when they came in contact with the trunk. Scorch marks can be seen in the bark where equally unsuccessful attempts to burn it down were made. The murders that once rocked this small town have largely been forgotten in the decades since, but the tree remains, a dark reminder of its bloody past. I switched the TV off and stared at the black screen, as my own pale face reflected in it. If I were older, maybe I would have tried to convince myself that I hadn't heard the ghost of Rachel Jackson playing out her last few minutes. Maybe I would have been able to make myself believe it had just been the wind and the rain in my own imagination, and this show was only a coincidence. But I was 12 and I knew what I heard. I learned to swim after that day. I started to fish and surf just like my friends. I made every excuse to not ever go back to that park. When my parents asked why I suddenly was so adamant about it, I just told them it was because I was tired of being bored and alone during the summer. The truth, though, was that I was far less afraid of the deep water and what lived in it than I was of Hangman's tree and those who had died. This happened about 2 months ago, and it's become a legend among my coworkers. One of them suggested I write it up and post it on this site. I'm a 44-year-old man living in Northern California. I work for a municipal water district in a small city way out in wine country, and basically my job is to deal with the various problems that arise from the water storage and transfer. If you've never been here, Napa County is mostly a giant marshland with tons of farms, vineyards, rolling hills, and small mountains to the east. On the other side of those mountains are more vineyards and wineries. This place is old, and so are the water storage tanks. We have towers, ground tanks, old standpipes, and even subterranean tanks, which we call watery graves, because of the danger of working with them and the occasional things you would find in them. I do physical checks on the tanks and assess for integrity, damage, tampering, or erosion, and take water samples for the guys back at our lab if I feel like the potable water could be contaminated. Essentially, I'm what happened to the water boy after his knees went bad and he retired from football. Unlike a lot of the jobs that take people to scary places like night security guards and park rangers, my job gives me the opportunity to see a lot of pretty sunsets and landscapes. And my visits to certain properties usually result in gifts of free wine or homemade cheeses. But every so often, creepy things do happen. I found a lot of crack pipes and dirty needles around the tanks, because rural teenagers use them for cover or as chill spots. I also find spent shells or bullet casings, and every once in a while, some dumbass uses the tank itself for target practice. I once found a pair of bloody underwear in the field, near the base of a tower, and some obvious signs of struggle. I definitely called that one in. Until 2 months ago, the weirdest thing that I ever saw while I was driving through the mountain pass in the evening were two dudes in a horse costume were casually making their way down the road. Then one evening, I got a PAR, which is a property access request, on the way home from work. The site was way up past the state park in the eastern hills. Most of the jobs up there are simply checking the tanks on old dirt roads or talking to the ranchers about the irrigation and plumbing. That area is covered in crazy thick woods and all the roads are dark and windy. Now technically, I could have done this job the following day, but if I finished it that night, I would be able to cut the next day's workload in half and start my weekend early. So I went. It was just after 8 p.m. by the time I got there, and it was starting to get dark. I had to pay attention because I had never been to this specific place before. It took me a while to find the road that led to the site, but soon, I made a left turn off the main highway and headed down a dusty little one-way road that snaked through the woods. About a quarter mile in, I rolled past a young woman standing by a tree. By the plainness of her clothes, I figured she was one of the locals, probably a rancher's daughter. The woman looked to be in her late teens or early 20s, and she held in her arms a gray cat. The two didn't appear to be heading in any particular direction and just watched me with empty stares as I drove by. It was a bit unnerving, and she completely vanished into darkness as soon as my headlights pointed away from her. But in another minute or two, I passed an old house and reasoned that it had to be her home. It was pitch black by the time I arrived on location. I had to use my high beams as there were no streetlights at all, and eventually I came upon a clearing. Off to the left side of the road was a big field with two ancient water tanks in it. No doubt fed by a well and underground filtration system further up on the hill behind them. I realized I'd be doing a lot of walking around then. A rickety wooden fence surrounded the field and a few horses ambled around inside of it. I found this a little weird because typically ranchers would house their animals at night since late frosts in Napa aren't too uncommon. The whole property seemed in despair, like no one had been around for a long time. If there's one thing you learn quick in my job, it's that farmers and folks who live in rural places or up in the mountains tend to have guns. The police take too long to get out there during emergencies, so these people look after their own. Therefore, wandering out to a tank unannounced is a good way to end up with a bullet in your spine, even if the tank isn't actually on their property. Even though I could probably sneak the job and get done faster, I opted instead to notify the owner of my presence. I drove a bit further as I came around another bend. Two people, both probably in their mid-30s, darted across the road and off into the field. The man was almost naked, except for his underwear and shoes, and the woman was dressed and clutched a bundle of sticks to her body. They looked afraid. I pulled the truck over and rolled down the window slightly, calling out to them, but they ignored me. With the window down, I could hear a third person crying somewhere off in the dark. I've heard of cons like this before, where people try to get you to pull over and then they murder or carjack you, so I kept my doors locked. There was nowhere to make a U-turn, which is exactly what I would have done in that moment. The road was no wider than my truck, plus another half of a car, so I'd have to lean over into the shoulder if another car came by. On the field side of the road, a steep 3-foot slope led down into the grass, precluding an attempt to double back. Dim light emanated from the windows of a large house up ahead, so I sped up to reach it. As I approached, more and more people appeared. They glowed in the light of my high beams, then vanished into the dark as I rolled by. Some of them were completely nude. Some buried their faces in their hands, and some staggered as if dazed, while others ran full sprint down the road behind me, trying to get away from something up ahead. At this point, all I wanted to do was make it to the driveway of the farmhouse so I could flip a U-turn and peel the heck out of there. I instantly regretted not owning a firearm, and the sense that I was in danger sort of strobed through my body like electricity. When I finally arrived at the house, I slammed on the brakes and slid across the gravel entryway. The sounds of screams, maybe dozens of different voices, rose and fell around my truck. The first thought was that there was some sort of party going on in the house, but some disaster happened, like maybe a fire or a shooting. The house sat slightly elevated on the hill, about 50 feet from the road on the right side. To the left was the edge of the field and a thick wall of woods. People were running away from the house towards the woods and field, shrieking and babbling and cursing. The house was raised enough on the nearby hill that my high beams lit up only the first floor. Darkness completely shrouded the rest of it. A long wooden porch ran the length of the building, and just beneath the porch on one side was a huge gaping hole. You know how some of the houses have crawl spaces where you can get under the foundation to run wires and cables and stuff? That's pretty much what this was, but except the hole was big enough to fit a car through, and it looked like it had exploded outwards from the inside, like someone had set off a stick of dynamite under there. Pouring from the blackness of the hole were droves of people. Some were naked, some were clothed, some were bloodied. They limped and screamed and crawled out of the hole like ants from a drowned nest, scratching at their hair and arms. One of them simply walked down to the right of the lawn in front of my truck, sat down cross-legged, and began praying with a big smile on her face. Some of them laughed hysterically and sang, then began screaming and crying like they couldn't control their emotions. Sitting on the porch, casting a silhouette from the lights inside, was a man. I couldn't see his face, but he looked down at the chaos unfolding below his house and looked over to me. He reached his hand up slowly and waved, acknowledging my presence, then just stared at me as if he was awaiting a response. If you've never seen a person dying in pain, they sound a lot like animals. The closer they get to death, the more their screams resolve into guttural howls. Someone inside that hole, deep down in the dark, was dying, while everyone else fled. They sounded like a tortured animal, and even though I was more afraid than I had ever been in my life, I still felt the momentary urge to rush inside and help. But another part of me knew that that's exactly what the man on the porch wanted. So instead, I threw my truck in reverse and backed out of the entryway, colliding with two people as I did, and blazed off into the night with total disregard for anybody running down that road. I noped out of there at warp speed and nearly wrapped my truck around an oak tree doing so. The drive back to the main highway took less than half the time it took me on the way out. My brain spat a million explanations at me, trying to rationalize what I'd just seen. It was a meth lab under the house that blew up, or a rave that went wrong, or some kind of devil-worshipping orgy of freaks. I'm not content with any of those explanations, but that's all I've got. And even though I'd probably seen 30 people flee that house and half of them ran down the road, I never spotted a single one of them on the drive back. The only person I did see was the young woman with the cat. They were standing in the same place as they were before. They hadn't moved an inch. As I blew past her, the woman waved at me. When I got back to the city at the bottom of the hill, I called 911 and told them what I saw. I also followed up with them in the days after that event, but I was never given much of an explanation. All I was told was that they were investigating suspicious activity. I don't take jobs out in that area anymore, and I always finish my work before dusk. There won't be a part 2 to this story because I'm not stupid enough to go back there. Sorry everybody, but I don't want to see that again. At the age of 32, it is still hard for me to talk about this. And this is why I chose to write about it. This form of communication is much less personal. It has been 23 years since it all took place. In the year of 1997, I was 9 years old. I am the only child in the family except for the dog we had at the time, Bear. My father is 10 years older than my mother. She was 20 when she gave birth to me, and my father was 30. Our small family was close and loving, and just as normal as all the other families in our middle-class neighborhood. My mother and my father worked full-time, so I spent a lot of time after school or during the summer with a babysitter. Always being with a babysitter wasn't that bad. My babysitter was named Sarah. She lived 4 doors down from us, and she had been my babysitter for the past 3 years, so we were quite used to each other. She was basically my older sister. Sarah had turned 18 2 months prior to her high school graduation. Come that July, she would be leaving state to start summer classes at her college. When my parents told me that Sarah would no longer be my babysitter, I immediately made a case about how I was ready to be without a babysitter. I mean, of course, at the age of 9, my parents protested this idea that I would be unsupervised all summer. You might be responsible, son, but it is illegal for us to leave you alone, my father told me. Unfortunately for us, I would eventually get what I wanted. My mother found a new babysitter through a program that Sarah told her about. This program was through the school, and it would give girls ages 17 to 15 a chance to make some money. My mother would give her information and what would be needed for the sitter. The girls that have signed up for the program would pick what job they wanted to take. When my parents got the call that they had me a new babysitter, they were relieved. But on a Monday morning when my mother actually had to leave for work, I could tell she was nervous. I was just as nervous and a little upset, if not more. Having to stay home with a strange person was frightening at that age, and besides, I felt that she wasn't needed. At 7:55 Monday morning, Rachel arrived. That day, my mother ordered me to spend some time inside with her so I could get to know her, because she could possibly be there all summer. Being the good boy that I was, I did what she said. The first hour or so was kind of awkward. It consisted of me trying to avoid her by going from room to room as she followed and tried to ask me questions to break the ice. After realizing she would not leave me alone, I caved in and I started to answer her. Although most of the questions were short, she was still very nice and she always kept a smile on her face. After about an hour or two of getting to know each other, Rachel let me play some Sega while she did her homework. She wasn't as bad as I thought she would be. I learned that she was 16. And Rachel had moved to town last summer with her aunt that she lived with. My mother was happy when she learned that it all went well and that Rachel and I got along. My mother also promised to me that I didn't have to spend all day inside tomorrow, and this was good news to me. Within 15 minutes of Rachel's arrival on day 2, I left to ride my bike with my friend Dylan. She just smiled and she told me to be safe. I spent all day outside, getting home right before my mom and dad got off work. Once again, my parents were happy that the day went well. On day 3, everything started off normal. I was playing some Sega when Rachel came into my room. "Why don't you want to hang out with me?" she asked. I told her that I was just playing some games and that there wasn't really much else to do. We should get to know each other a little bit better. I remember looking at her kind of confused. "You and I have a lot more in common than you think," she said sitting on my bed. I asked her what we could possibly have in common. "It's a secret, but for now let's play a game. We could play house. I'll be the older sister and you could be the little brother." I found it extremely odd that a 16-year-old girl would want to play a game with a 9-year-old boy. After about 30 minutes of this odd roleplay, I told her I was bored and I wanted to play something else. I remember her looking at me with a furrowed brow and that creepy smile she always wore. "We can never stop playing this game." That made me extremely uncomfortable, so I made some 9-year-old excuse and I walked out of the room, down the stairs, and out of the door. There I stayed until my mother got home. When my mother and I walked in together, Rachel was sitting at the kitchen table just doing some homework. When my mother asked how she was doing, Rachel looked at my mother and, with that smile, "Where's Mr. Gregor?" she asked, referring to my father. My mother must have thought it to be odd that a young girl was asking for her husband because I could tell that my mom hurried her out of the house. After ushering her out, my mother asked me what I thought of Rachel. I told her that I thought she was weird and I told her about the game of house she wanted to play. Once again, I saw an opportunity and I made my argument on being home alone, but once again I was denied. On day 4, everything changed. Once my mother left for work, Rachel asked me if I wanted to go for a bike ride. No matter who she was, being 9, I thought it was a great idea. We rode through my block and down the main road for about a mile. At this point, I didn't know what was going on, and it seemed that she was taking me somewhere else. When we finally stopped, we were in front of a bunch of apartments. "You want to see my friends?" Rachel asked me. Without me answering her, she grabbed my hand and led me into the apartment complex. She took me to a door on the 2nd floor and knocked on it. From behind the door, I could hear a man. "Who is it?" "It's me, Rachel." I could hear the man sigh. "Get out of here. I told you I don't want you around here anymore," the man said from behind the door. "I just wanted to show you my little brother," Rachel said in a loud voice. "Get the hell out of here. You're crazy," the man stated, sounding very annoyed. "My family is real. I told you I had a brother. He's right here. Look, he's real." "Get the hell out of here or I'm gonna call the cops," said the man. At that point, Rachel pounded on the man's door with both fists, then looked at me enraged. Out of nowhere, she just turned and started walking down the hallway back from where we came. I was petrified and it took me a few seconds to realize that she was leaving me. I sprinted to catch up to her and she never said a word when I did catch up. The whole bike ride back home, both of us were silent. When we got back to the house, I was still pretty shaken up, so I told her I was going to go to my friend Dylan's house. As I left through the garage door, she said something that has rang in my head to this day. "You're just like your father." That day, I waited at my friend's house till 5:30, which was about 30 minutes after my mom got home. When I walked in the door, my mother looked a little disturbed. She told me that when she came into the house, she found Rachel upstairs in my parents' room, laying in their bed. When my mother asked me how the day went, I told her what happened. I told her about riding on the main road that my parents have always forbidden me to do. My mother was furious. She told me to go back to Dylan's house and she would call me home for dinner. When I finally was allowed back home, I was nervous and scared that maybe I was in trouble. But to my relief, I wasn't. My mom told me that Rachel would no longer be my babysitter and that tomorrow I would be staying with Mr. and Mrs. Charles. They were an older couple across the street. Once again, I made my case about being home alone, but again, I was shut down. The next morning, I sat at Mr. and Mrs. Charles' house almost all day. They were nice enough, but they could not keep a 9-year-old entertained. Around 1 p.m., Mr. Charles was getting ready for his nap, and I asked Mrs. Charles if I could run home real quick to get a toy to play with. Reluctantly, she agreed, knowing that my mother told her not to let me leave, but she could tell I was dying of boredom. When I got into the house, I was kind of scared knowing that I was all alone. I ran upstairs immediately to my room, and when I opened the door, I was startled to see Rachel in my room. She was wearing that creepy smile again. I took a deep breath in horror and took a few steps back. She lunged forward and grabbed me. Being scared and 9 years old, I didn't know what to do. Rachel pulled out some rope that she found in our garage. She tied up my hands behind my back and tied my feet to the bedpost. After she realized I wasn't going anywhere, she relaxed a bit. She pulled out a small pocket knife from one of her pockets. For the next 3 hours, she proceeded to explain to me that my dad was also her dad. Between her crying and pacing back and forth, She said that our dad left her mother when Rachel was born for my mom. Rachel kept telling me that I took her family and that I was the reason she couldn't be happy. But I would pay. We just have to wait for our dad to get home so he knows what he has done. I was absolutely horrified. I couldn't yell, fight, or scream for help. All I could do was cry. I thought that I was going to die by this girl and her pocket knife. After sitting tied up for several hours, I thought all was hopeless. While Rachel was sitting on my bed with a blank stare in between her crying, I could hear what I thought was the sound of someone walking up the stairs. La Palma Police, is there anyone upstairs? At that exact moment, Rachel snapped up. I screamed louder than ever I have in my whole life. While I screamed for help, Rachel climbed behind me and put the knife to the side of my face. I could feel her heavy breath on the back of my neck. A police officer turned the corner of my room and pulled his gun out. He looked at both of us and I could see the change in his face when he realized the situation. He slowly put his gun back in his holster. "Okay, what's going on here?" asked the policeman. Already crying, Rachel screamed, "I just want my family." About 20 minutes went by with the policeman trying to calm Rachel down. When 2 more cops showed up, Rachel's attitude changed. She got more aggressive and at this point was pushing the blade into the meat of my arm. All I could do was cry and whimper for help. In between arguing with the police, crying and waving the knife around, she would whisper to me, "It'll all be over soon." Without Rachel realizing, one of the cops moved into a position to where he could tase and subdue her without getting me hurt. The rest of the night, I don't quite remember. All I can see is Rachel being tackled to the floor. I remember my mom and dad crying when I was cut free and on the way to the hospital for stitches. I had to get 6 stitches. My parents never talked about this summer, probably in hopes that it would be forgotten. But I could never forget what happened to me. At the age of 18, I asked my dad what he could remember from that night. I could tell he was uncomfortable about telling me, but said that I was old enough. What he told me made the whole situation worse. He said that the babysitter, Rachel's real name was Amanda. Her mother died in a house fire a year prior to us meeting her. Amanda was nowhere to be found and was reported missing after the fire. She was the only suspect they had for the house fire. Her father did in fact leave her mother when she was born, but later died in a car accident shortly afterwards. She was never actually related to my family, and it was just a complete mental breakdown, I guess. Mrs. Charles had dozed off after I went to get that toy. When she woke up 2 hours later, she remembered me, and when the cops showed up to my house, the front door was left wide open. This really freaked me out because none of us could have avoided this. This Amanda girl was going to lose it eventually, and it just happened to be with me and my family. She's locked up now and serving life in some sort of mental institution for the murder of her mother. The hardest part of all of this is the fact that I now have a 9-year-old myself. He's an only child, other than our dog Odin. My wife and I work full time, but our long-term babysitter is quitting for a real job and I'm not sure what to do. After the summer of '94, my parents felt that I no longer needed a babysitter. So I'm stuck with this question. Do I leave my 9-year-old home alone all summer, or do I find a stranger to watch him? Are you afraid of the dark? If not, you probably were as a child. Go ahead, admit it. There's nothing to be ashamed of. It's a common fear. The terror of night is deeply rooted in the human psyche. It's a primal fear, an instinct necessary for survival. Even when there is no immediate danger, even when we know we are perfectly safe, we still jump at every little noise and hide under the covers, so that whatever lurks in the shadows can't see us. Yes, many of us are afraid of the dark. You may very well be one of them, but have you ever considered that this fear might be meaningless? I'll let you in on a little secret. It isn't the dark you should fear, but rather the light of day. You may scoff at this, thinking that it makes no sense, but please bear with me for a moment. And let me explain why our fear of the dark is pointless and why our belief in the safety of light is dangerously naive. Now, before we begin, I should mention that this isn't really my story per se. The events I'm about to recount have happened to a good friend of mine, and while I was there to witness much of it, I didn't experience it the way David did. But David is no longer around to tell his story, and among his family and friends, I'm the one who seems willing to talk about what happened. So this is what happened to David, through the eyes of someone who knew him well and loved him deeply, and wants people to know how he died so that maybe others can avoid the same fate. Okay, enough rambling. Let's begin. David and I became close friends since we were in kindergarten, and David, like many children his age, were afraid of the dark. He slept with a nightlight and believed that there were ghosts hiding in his closet and a monster under his bed. He claimed he could hear things whispering in the dark, and while he never saw anything, he could sense their presence. Nobody took this very seriously, since David was known to have an overactive imagination, but they were certain he would eventually grow out of it. And he did. Somewhat. He stopped talking about ghosts and monsters and ditched the nightlight in 4th grade, but he still became noticeably jittery whenever the sun went down, jumping at the tiniest noises, and his eyes would dart around frantically around the room as he searched for something only he could see. The trouble began in the fall of 2015, during our 2nd year of college. David had moved out of his parents' house over the summer, settling in a cramped apartment with his girlfriend Savannah, whom he had met the year before when they were paired as lab partners in his chemistry class. The two were quite content with their new living conditions until one October morning, when Savannah called me out of nowhere and told me that something was wrong with David. "What do you mean?" I asked. Savannah explained that David had been acting really paranoid lately. When he was alone in his apartment, he would close all the blinds and turn off the lights. Given his lifelong fear of the dark, this was more than a little bizarre. "You're his best friend, Amber," Savannah pleaded. "You probably know him better than me. What should I do?" I bit my lip, confused and not knowing what to make of the situation. "Have you tried talking to him about it?" "Of course, but he just denies there being anything wrong. At first, I thought he was just stressed from school and work, plus moving into a new place, but I think it might be more serious than that." "That is strange," I admitted, "but I'm sure there's a logical explanation." "I don't know, Amber. Why won't he tell me what's wrong? He knows I love him." "He probably doesn't want to burden you," I soothed. "Let me talk to him. Maybe I can help." "Thank you, Amber." There was a muffled curse, then, "I'm late for class and I'll talk to you later." She hung up. I was also late for class, so I left my own apartment, which I shared with 3 other girls, and burned rubber on the 5-minute drive to college. I only had morning classes that day, so I texted David and asked him if he wanted to meet me for lunch at our favorite place. He agreed. When I saw him, I was shocked. It had only been 4 days since I'd last seen him in person, but the change was shocking. He looked sickly pale, and his normally bright green eyes were muted, dull, and framed in thick dark rings. His hair was disheveled, and his whole body vibrated as if he had an electric current running beneath his skin. "Hi, Amber," he stammered, forcing a painful grin. "How are you doing?" "David, you look awful." "Call me what you want, but I've never been the type to mince words." "Yeah, I know. I haven't been sleeping very well. I think I've developed insomnia from staying up all night studying. I'm going to visit the doctors this week and see if I can get some sleeping pills." We got seated and ordered our food, and I told him what Savannah had said. "She's worried about you, David." "She worries too much," he said, flicking his hand dismissively. "Don't get me wrong, I love that girl more than I love myself, but it would do her some good just to loosen up a little." "David, if something is wrong, you can tell me. You know I'm always here for you." "Amber." "David," I countered, my voice stern. I was only a couple months older than him, but David looked up to me, and when I got stern with him, he shaped up immediately. "Don't lie to me. If you don't speak now, I'll have to resort to more underhanded methods." He winced and then sighed, scrubbing at his face with his hands. "Promise you won't laugh or call me crazy." "Well, I guess it depends on what you tell me. I might not be able to help it." "Can you at least try?" I smiled. "Of course." He sighed again and then looked me dead in the eye and said, "Something is haunting me." Normally I would have scoffed at this, but he looked genuinely afraid, and that worried me. "What? Something's haunting you?" "Yeah." He took a sip of his water and stared into the glass. "It only comes during the day and when there's a lot of light. This thing, whatever it is, well, I guess it can't see in the dark because it can't find me so easily. So I'm safest at night, I mean, it still hangs around, but it can't get me." I won't lie, I felt like I had bugs crawling under my skin. "Is it with you now?" He glanced over his shoulder, nervous and shaking. "I don't see it, but I know it's here." The waitress brought our food, but I wasn't sure I could eat. "David, are you on drugs?" I knew he had experimented with pot during high school, so it wasn't out of the realm of possibility. David shook his head frantically. No, this is real, Amber. Something is after me." He let out a mad cackle. "Isn't that weird? I used to be terrified of the dark, but now the dark is my haven. Isn't that crazy?" "David, you need help. This isn't normal." "I'm not insane, Amber," he insisted, but he had a deranged look in his eyes that made me seriously question this statement. Afraid for my friend's mental state, I set him up for an appointment with one of the campus counselors. David also went to his doctor as planned and was prescribed sleeping pills and anti-anxiety medication. For a while, things were looking up. David's color returned and he seemed more relaxed. But everything went to hell again in January. We went to a local club to celebrate the new year. I had a lot to drink that night, and yes, I'm a heavy drinker, I get it, but my memory might not be 100%. But I have a good grasp on what happened. We were at a club with a bunch of our friends, and the place was having a disco-themed night. There was a spinning ball overhead, flashing bright, multicolored lights across the dance floor. We were having a blast when David, out of nowhere, began screaming like a maniac. To this day, I can't get those terrible sounds out of my head. They were loud enough to compete with the music, and everyone stopped to stare. The bouncers assumed David was high or dangerously insane and threw him out of the club, and the rest of us followed him. We found David in a back alley, screaming bloody murder and banging his head against the brick wall. "It's back! It's back!" he screamed. "It's coming for me! It's coming for me!" We managed to calm down David enough to get him in the car and rush him to the hospital. He needed stitches in his forehead and was admitted to the psych ward, where he would stay for weeks. He was diagnosed as schizophrenic and put on a stronger dose of medication. During therapy sessions, he would ramble on about an evil entity with glowing red eyes and a twisted face that watched him from the corners of the room and was empowered by the light. He spoke about the beings that had haunted him through his childhood and which he now believed had been protecting him from his current tormentor. He drew pictures of what he saw, but since he requested they be destroyed, I never got to see him. Savannah did, however, but she couldn't give me any details beyond. If there's really a hell, those are the kind of creatures that live there. Eventually, the doctors were able to get David under control, and they sent him home with a prescription of antipsychotic drugs and a recommendation to see a psychiatrist regularly. We all thought the terror was over, but it wasn't. It wasn't. David's behavior became increasingly more erratic. He insisted on keeping the lights off at all times and would flip out if they were turned on. He even went so far as to cover all the windows of him and Savannah's apartment in newspapers. Savannah couldn't take it anymore and eventually moved out. David's grades began to slip and I saw him less and less. He stopped answering my calls and texts and I began to fear the worst. Things finally came to a head that March. David stopped showing up to classes and work, and then the police were called to check on him. When the cops sent over entered his apartment, he found the place in a mess. The windows were covered and the bulbs were removed from all the light fixtures. The officer found David huddled in his bedroom closet, muttering about something coming to kill him. When the cops shone the flashlight on him, David began screaming and attacked the poor man, breaking his nose. Backup was called and David was taken back to the psych ward. An inspection of the apartment revealed that he had been subsiding on instant coffee and his pills. He only weighed 90 pounds. You read that right. A 5'10" man only weighing 90 pounds. I'm surprised he was still alive when they found him. After being admitted to the hospital for a second time, David lapsed into a catatonic state, occasionally muttering about something coming for him and that his end was near. He was placed on a suicide watch while the doctors tried to figure out how to treat him. On March 25th, 2016, David was found dead in his room. There were holes in the walls and the mattress had been shredded. Blood was splattered everywhere and David himself was covered in defensive wounds. He had obviously put up one hell of a fight, but nobody reported hearing anything and the autopsy report was inconclusive. To this day, his death is still an open case, a burning question with no answer. David's death shattered me. Not only had I lost my best friend, but knowing how he died, so frightened and alone, still haunts me. I believe what he saw was real and that he was killed by a sinister entity drawn to him by the light. Maybe I'm crazy, but I saw David deteriorate. I saw the terror in his eyes. I know the truth is out there, but I just don't know where to look, and that's what really gets to me. I want people to know what happened to David, to understand that there are truly some unexplainable things out there. I don't want him to be remembered as the poor insane man when he was killed by something he couldn't fight off. Now I sleep with my blinds drawn and doors shut, blocking out any traces of light. I often go for long walks at night and I feel safest when the moon is out. After all, it isn't the dark you should fear. It's the harsh light of day that brings out the real monsters. A few months ago, I came across something that would have been better left alone. But due to my carelessness, I found myself with a story worth telling. It was May, the day of my high school graduation. I was honestly surprised I had managed to get through my senior year without failing any classes, especially considering what was going on in my life outside of school. My little brother was sick, and he had been for years. He had just turned 14 that month and was already into his third year of treatment. Nothing was working, not the way his doctors wanted it to, and not the way we wanted it to. But still, the specialists were so hopeful. We were all on the hook every time they said they had a new option they could try. But nothing ever changed. Owen was diagnosed just after he turned 11, and since then, things at home have been tough. The playful little kid that bruised like a peach was not the somber little boy being poked and prodded in the hospital rooms. Things had to change, and he couldn't do all the things he used to do as his disease became more and more severe, and the treatments began to take a toll on him. Time passed, and things only became harder, and he was really sick. The therapy was getting to him. When he was home, he was constantly in the bathroom. He just couldn't keep anything down. He complained about the pain he was feeling, but only when he couldn't bear it any longer. He didn't want to make our parents feel any worse about the situation. It's hard enough having a child with cancer, but harder still to know that they aren't getting any better and each day is more painful than the last. He still smiled though, and he still joked around. He would laugh at me for attending school while his assignments were brought home to work on at his leisure. He was still a kid, just one that couldn't get out of bed without leaving a trail of bruises along himself. But a kid. We all tried our best to remain as positive as he was about this. It got harder to remain positive as time went on. Owen got sicker, and eventually our parents had to move him out of our home. Somehow, my parents managed to stay strong and hopeful through it all. They never seemed to despair too greatly over the fact that their child may never be cured. Owen was away from home only a few months before his body gave up. He was gone, and the years of hospitals, treatments, and tests were over. I was on my way home from my last day of school when I got the news. A few days later, we held the funeral. My mother was in hysterics, and half of Owen's school showed up to the service. It was heartbreaking. All those sad young children crying over the death of a child they had grown up playing with. Seeing how much his friends missed him only made me miss him more. I'd be an only child from now on. No younger sibling to teach or tease. At the same time, the service gave me a sort of peace. I felt like Owen would have loved seeing all the people he cared about come and bid him farewell. I felt like he had the best life that he could have had, and everything would be okay for him now that he had moved on. It was a little over a week later when I found something I shouldn't have. I had to search around the house to find shoes for the graduation ceremony, but my mother had recently gone on a cleaning spree. Everything in an unnecessary location that wasn't being used had to be put away in the closets, and I was trying to pull out a shoebox in the top of her bedroom closet when it hit me. Literally. A piece of paper from somewhere on top of the shelf had fallen. The corner poked me in the arm as it fell. I pulled the shoebox down and placed it on the ground, then stopped to inspect what had hit me. It was a picture of Owen, from when he was younger and hadn't been diagnosed. He looked so innocent. Just the trace of a smile beginning to form. I smiled back. The photo triggered happy memories of my brother as a joyful, illness-free child. The photograph seemed to waver as I stared at it, and suddenly I realized that it was moving. Owen's expression had turned into a full-tooth smile, and he seemed to be staring at me from within it. As the realization hit me, I heard the groan of wood shifting, and suddenly the shelf above me gave way and the contents came crashing down upon me. I winced in pain as a tumble of books and boxes rained down on top of me. I wasn't badly damaged, but I heard footsteps approaching to inspect the noise. I quickly tucked the photo into the shoebox that I had taken down and began organizing the things that had fallen. My father entered the room and asked what I did, and I informed him that the shelf in the closet had collapsed. He mumbled something about fixing it later and me tidying it up, and then he walked away. I quickly placed the fallen objects neatly in the bottom of the closet and retreated to my bedroom with the shoebox. I stared at the picture again, wondering if I had just imagined the smile. It looked exactly as it had when I first picked it up. I put the photo in the dresser drawer and planned on reviewing it after I had gotten ready for my graduation ceremony. Once I was ready, I sat down in my bed and pulled the photo back out. I couldn't help but smile again about how innocent he looked, and then it happened again. Just a twitch. Maybe it was my imagination, but the hand that was raised in the photo appeared to wave just slightly. It was like he was saying hello. At that moment, my mother walked in the room to announce our departure, and I quickly tucked the photograph beneath my pillow. For some reason, I wanted to keep it to myself. I thought about the picture as we got in the car, wondering if I had some symptom of grief that made me imagine it had moved. We pulled out of the driveway and onto the road. I was just lost in thought of what had happened. My father was at the wheel, and suddenly we swerved hard. Too hard. We were off the side of the road and into the ditch before I even had a moment to register anything that had happened. My seatbelt locked before the car came to its abrupt stop, and I could feel the belt cut into me when I was thrown against it. The windshield had shattered, and we had hit a small cluster of trees in the ditch, and my mother was resting unconscious against her airbag. My dad seemed way less for wear. He had several cuts on his face, but he was coherent enough to pull his phone from his pocket and call the authorities. Red lights, blue lights, police cars, and ambulances. My father told me not to move, not to get out of the car, and I didn't want to anyways. I felt nauseated. The spot where the belt still dug into me stung, and there was pain in more spots of my body than I could even count. It was so much that I couldn't even tell where the pain was coming from. Maybe I went into shock. I don't remember much after the cars and the lights. I missed my graduation, and they offered to mail me my diploma. The hospital never seemed to be the right temperature. I was always uncomfortable. I was cut and bruised and had a mild concussion, along with one of my ribs being fractured. My father made it out almost exactly the same as me, but my mother didn't fare as well. She suffered some severe head trauma in the accident and would be in the hospital for a while to make sure that she got better. As we were leaving the hospital room, I nearly asked if we were going to see how Owen was next, but then I remembered that he hadn't been with us. Of course he hadn't been with us. My father and I went home, and I sat in my room staring at the picture. It remained still, looking like a perfectly normal photo of my brother. I sighed, intending to put the photograph back into my drawer, when my father walked into the room mid-question. "Have you seen—" He paused as he noticed the photo in my hand. "Where did you get that?" I shrugged and explained it, falling from the closet the other day, while holding it out for him to take. He gave me an odd squinted glance as he practically snatched the picture from my hand. "You shouldn't be touching things that don't belong to you," he warned me as he left the room. I didn't understand the strangeness over the photo, but somewhere in the back of my mind I questioned whether or not the picture moved for my father too. I listened as he walked away and heard him enter his room. I quietly snuck into the hallway and saw that his bedroom door had not been entirely shut. I crept forward and peered through the crack as he sat on his bed with his back mostly to the door. He stared at the photo while speaking quietly. "I know we're not supposed to do this anymore. I just miss you so much. This was supposed to make things easier, but it's not. I'm sorry. I hope you're okay, buddy." He was quiet after that, and his shoulders shook as though he was crying. My curiosity had long since faded, and I snuck back into my own room to collect my thoughts. I was unsure what my father had meant as he spoke to the picture. What was supposed to make things better? Did he see the picture move like I did? My thoughts were interrupted by the doorbell ringing, and I heard my father's heavy footfalls as he headed from his bedroom to the stairs. I got up to follow, curious to see who might be visiting us. I wasn't too far behind him when he started down the stairs. I saw clearly as he tripped over thin air and tumbled down almost the entire staircase. He was in a heap at the bottom, groaning in pain as I ran down the stairs to help him. He couldn't stand, and I was too small to lift him. It struck me that whoever rang the doorbell could help him off the ground. I ran to the front door, only to discover an empty porch. I was frustrated that whoever had come had been so impatient. I retreated back to the bottom of the stairs, where my father was now attempting to get up without putting any weight on his left leg. I managed to get myself in a position where I could help him hobble his way around, and he instructed me to take him to the hospital. We had been home only for a few hours, and now we were going right back to the hospital. He thought his hip might be broken. It takes almost a half an hour to get to the hospital, and I figured that it was enough time alone in a confined space where he couldn't walk away from the conversation, so I asked the question that was eating at me. "What were you saying to that photograph earlier? What were you not supposed to do?" I kept my eyes on the road while I waited for his response. "You were listening?" "Casey, you're too young to deal with these things." His voice was strained from whatever injury his fall had caused. He proceeded into the usual lecture of how I was 18 now and things that involved the family and my brother should involve me. I had to know what was going on. He gave in. I'm not sure if it was because he didn't want to deal with my stubbornness during the drive or if he thought I really deserved to know. He told me that it began while they were in the process of discussing with Owen's doctors the issue of keeping him home or having him in the hospital full time. After a meeting with the doctors, they ran into a man outside of the hospital. He claimed that he had heard of Owen's case and had helped several families in similar situations before. He invited them to dinner and they discussed the offer. They didn't think anything was off at first. The dinner was expensive and the stranger spoke like a professional businessman. He advised my parents to put Owen in the hospital, and he offered them a unique way to keep the happy spirit of their child ever present. Of course, they accepted the offer. Their son was sicker than they had ever experienced, and they knew that he was dying. All they had to do was bring this man a photo of Owen before he got sick. It was that simple, and within a few days, the photo was in an envelope in our mailbox. But it was different. As Owen got sicker, the photo seemed to come alive more. My parents watched their son smile and play through the photograph while simultaneously watching him waste away in a hospital room. They didn't even bother questioning how it was possible. With the picture came a note, a warning. As their child faded away more, this memory would come to life in equal measures. If the child was to die, misfortune would fall upon the person who stirred his memory. The picture was consuming the parts of Owen's soul that were fading from his body. He was in the picture. I deserved this, my father pointed at his hip as he finished recalling the arrangement he'd made. I had no idea how to react to this information I had just received. I remember thinking that's it. The shelf, the car accident, the stairs, all after looking at this photo. To this day, I still don't understand how any of this could be possible. We pulled up to the hospital and I ran inside to get a wheelchair to bring my father in. He advised me to go home and rest for the night and then come back again in the morning when we could visit. I went home and thought about everything over and over again. Was it a demon? Didn't there have to be a catch to this deal? How far would the misfortune go? I feared losing more family members over the choice my parents had made, and I worried about Owen's soul. Was he truly at peace being trapped inside a picture? Stuck in a memory of life he can no longer live. It felt wrong, and by the time that I had to ride home, I made an irreversible decision. I entered the house and went immediately to my parents' room where the picture had been left behind. I hesitated for only a moment, wishing this would give my brother peace, before I flicked the lighter and set the photo on fire. I stared and held on until the fire got too close. The picture was ash before it hit the ground. I felt better. I felt like I had done the right thing. Like I had freed my brother from the selfish curse that my parents had agreed to. I slept that night hoping everything would be better, that the misfortune the photo had caused would be over. I visited my parents the next morning. My father had already rolled himself into a room by the time I got there. Apparently he had also filled her in on my knowledge of the photograph. She apologized profusely for not telling me. She claimed she felt terrible that she had kept a secret for so long. I told her that it was okay and everything was going to be okay now. I had burned the photo, and Owen should be free and we shouldn't have any more accidents. She gave me a weak smile and held onto my hand as my father hugged me. He was happy that I had had the sense to do what they couldn't bring themselves to do. We sat and chatted for a bit until my father wheeled away to get some snacks, and that's when my mother gestured for me to come close so she could whisper something to me. I wanted to destroy the picture right after Owen died. I was going to. I didn't tell your father about this, and you shouldn't either. He couldn't take it. The man, the one we made an arrangement with. He showed up at the office. I was about to go home and get rid of the photo, and he stopped me at my car. He told me if I destroyed it, then the soul would go back into the body, even if the body was dead. And I just couldn't bring myself to do it. I thought about that for a moment, and I almost shouted my first thought. He's alive. My mother shook her head and motioned for me to quiet down. Honey, don't you know how bodies are prepared for burials? He might have a soul, but he's certainly not alive. I sat down as the realization of what I'd done sunk in. We haven't talked about it since that day, and the photograph has been blacklisted in our home. It's been a few months since then, and I can't help but think about how it's my fault that my brother's soul will forever be stuck in a decaying body beneath 6 feet of dirt. Have you tried that augmented reality ghost app? You can't download it on the App Store. It was there for a few days, but Apple took it down after a horrific accident. It was on the news that a man killed himself because of what the app made him see. That man was my brother, and I'm here to tell you his story. First, about the app. It's called Spirit Caller. The app's description said that if someone had died in a certain spot, the app would call the person's spirit back to that spot. You could then see and talk to the person through your smartphone camera and speaker. I mean, sounds bogus enough. It's funny how my brother discovered the app. He was searching for Spirit Airlines app so he could book a flight to Atlanta for a medical school interview. Anyway, he clicked on the app for Spirit Caller by mistake, and intrigued by the idea of another augmented reality experience in Pokemon Go, he downloaded it onto his iPhone. Anyway, he clicked on the app for Spirit Caller by mistake, and intrigued by the idea of another augmented reality experience since Pokemon Go, he downloaded it onto his iPhone. Now, my brother never believed in the paranormal, but neither did I, and I still don't know what to believe. But what I witnessed, I can't explain. That's why I must tell you all, so you can help me understand what actually happened. Okay, this could be kind of cool, my brother said as he opened the app. I was driving him to the mall near our suburban Massachusetts town. It was so good to spend time with him after he'd been away at university, and I knew it wouldn't be much longer before he left for medical school. What do you mean? I said, peering at the app loading screen. The words Spirit Caller were written in a boxy, all-caps font. They didn't fit in with the plain beige background. What's this now? Augmented reality, my brother said. Didn't you see that awesome demo Apple released on YouTube? Why would I watch that? The demo was pretty cool, my brother said. You look through the camera and something is there that isn't in real life. It's like with Pokemon Go, but 10 times better. Imagine looking through the camera and seeing someone sitting in the back seat. The app had finally loaded and it looked like the camera app, but without a shutter button. My brother panned the camera around the car, but there were no spirits to be found. I don't see anything, I said. It says you gotta be where somebody died, so maybe a graveyard? Dude, no one actually dies in a graveyard. Yeah, but maybe it uses geolocation to decide where to show us the ghosts, my brother said, kinda like Pokemon Go. It's just a stupid app. I seriously doubt it has the budget to be anything like Pokemon Go. Yeah, you're right. My brother closed the app and put his phone away. It's probably just some programmer messing with us. We stopped at the mall. Barely anyone was shopping on this humid and sunny July morning. My brother tried on suits at Macy's and I stopped at GameStop to aimlessly browse the shelves, even though I only buy digital now. On the way home, we decided to drive by a graveyard. Stop for a bit, man, I just want to try something, my brother said. Dude, you can't be serious. Come on, aren't you at least a little curious? I remembered when we were kids. Spending time with my brother and going on stupid adventures was the world to me back then. Even if it was just playing pirate ship on our bunk bed. I stopped the car at the side of the road, just outside the graveyard. We got out and walked down the tree-shaded path to the open gates. No one was around. My brother took out his phone and opened the app. He looked like an idiot panning his camera around. He focused on different gravestones. I hadn't been in the cemetery since our father passed away. There was nothing dreadful about this graveyard. It seemed like the most peaceful and solemn of places. No way, my brother said. Holy crap. I turned around to see him stumble backwards and drop his phone. What? I saw something. I saw something. It was right there. I chuckled. Okay, what did you see? A woman. She was standing right over there. He picked up his phone and luckily the case had saved it. She was dressed in black and veiled, like a widower. I laughed. Okay, then where is she? My brother panned the phone around. Dude, I swear, I saw her, over this spot. He pointed at a plot in the ground. There was no tombstone over this plot, it was just a small plaque in the earth inscribed with the words, Joseph A. Dennell, 1812 to 1897. God took him, and he died in prayer. You saw a woman, I said, but I'm pretty sure Joseph is a man's name. There was another plaque next to that one, and on it were the words, Bertha A. Dennell, 1809 to 1897. Grief took her. She died on the spot, and I decided it was better not to tell my brother. I swear, dude, it looks so real, my brother said. Her mouth was filled with maggots and her skin was rotted off. She stared right at me through the camera and smiled with the most deranged smile. Then she ran at me. I grabbed his phone from him and pressed the sleep button. Look, it's probably just a viral campaign for some horror movie. Maybe the ghost only appears sometimes, or like you said, in certain spots. My brother looked shaken, and the sweat glistened on his forehead. Yeah, let's just go home. He didn't sleep that night. During summer vacation, I usually stayed up till around 5 a.m. playing games, and I heard him pacing back and forth around his room all night. At 4:45, I became concerned and knocked on his door. "Dude, what are you doing?" I said. He had a cup of coffee in his hands, and his eyes were red. "A man who downloaded that app is dead." "What?" "I've been up all night researching everything about it. People who download that app start behaving strangely. One man even stabbed himself in the eye." "Dude, what the heck?" I didn't know what to say, so I followed him to his laptop. "A suicide note was found with his body." He scrolled to a picture of the note. It said, "I gave my soul to it. Now Lizzie won't cry forever." Scrawled and repeated a dozen times. Lizzie was the dead man's dead daughter, apparently. I shook my head. Come on, this all must be part of the viral campaign. My eyelids felt heavy. Look, just forget about all this and go to sleep. Let's talk about it in the morning, I yawned, or afternoon. There's something messed up going on here, my brother said. There's no way it's a viral campaign. What could it possibly be? It's just a bit of code on a phone. If you're so scared, why not just delete the app? I can't, my brother said. It won't let me delete it. Okay, that sounds ridiculous. I picked up my brother's phone and scrolled to the app. How do you delete apps on this thing? I asked. Just hold it down until the app started dancing. So I did. The app started shaking, but there's no way to delete it. You're the tech guy in the family, my brother said. There has to be another way to delete it, right? Of course there is. Let's just figure it out in the morning, okay? My brother grabbed the phone and held the button to shut it off. Yeah, for sure. Good night, man. I went back to my room and shut the lights off, and sleep shortly took me. The aroma of buttery pancakes woke me. The digital clock on my bedside table read 11:42 a.m. Not being one to deny myself hot syrupy pancakes, I thundered downstairs and into the kitchen. Mom stood over the stove, piling fresh pancakes onto a plate. Good noon, she said. I was about to stir you from your coma. The pancakes did that. I grabbed a couple of them, some maple syrup, and I got down to business. Before you start, my mom said, go wake your brother, he's usually up earlier. I knocked on his door, but to no response. I creaked the door open and peeked inside. He wasn't there. He's not here, I said, and I got back to my pancakes. Really? I didn't see him leave. After you finish, give him a call, would you? I lay down on the couch in the living room, bleary-eyed and full of pancake goodness. I called my brother. Hello? Dude, where are you? Mom made pancakes. You're not still using that app, are you? Remember where they found Dad? What? I always wanted to know. Know what? Did he kill himself? Dude, are you serious? I'm going to ask him. He hung up, and now I have to explain something. My father died when I was 9, and his body was found on a hiking trail a few miles from where we lived at the time. He had fallen off a cliff and died on impact. The week before that, he had lost his job, a high-paying finance job that provided for us. Not only that, he was also under investigation for financial crimes. So the life insurance company launched an investigation into his death to determine if it was a suicide. It was determined to have been an accident because my father had fallen backwards and landed on his back. We still survive off the payout. I called my brother back, but once again it was no response. I called 5 more times and he just wouldn't pick up. I grabbed my car keys and I told my mom, I'm going out for a bit, I'll be back later. I settled into my musty Mazda and was on my way. Wadsworth Falls, Connecticut. I put it into my Google Maps. I tried calling my brother a few more times on the way, but it was to no avail. After many hours, I was there, in the wilderness and on the trail. It looked so familiar. As a family, we would hike this trail all the time when my dad was still alive. We would picnic at the top, near the waterfall, and my mom made these delicious tuna sandwiches. She never makes them anymore. It was a blistering hot afternoon, and like an idiot, I hadn't brought a bottle of water. Exhausted after an hour of walking, I sat in the shade beneath a tree. I took out my phone and I luckily still had signal. I went to the app store and searched for Spirit Caller. Apparently it wasn't available in the Google Play Store. I googled it to check if there was an APK for Android, but there wasn't. The July humidity felt heavy on my eyelids. I couldn't keep my eyes open and I drifted to sleep. A shrill scream woke me. It was dark and I had been asleep for a couple hours. Had I been dreaming or was that scream real? Clouds blocked the moonlight on this black night and I switched on my phone's flashlight and walked on. A while later my phone rang and it was my brother. "Where are you?" I asked. "I saw Dad." "Are you still on the trail? Tell me exactly where." I turned the speakerphone on so I could talk and use the flashlight, and I hurried up the trail. "I talked to him," my brother said. "He looked the same as the day he killed himself. Listen, I'm coming, just wait for me, okay? Dad said something is punishing him for what he did." I ran up the trail, and it got steeper as the tree growth thickened. "None of it is real," I said. "You know that, right? It won't let his soul go, unless I give it mine." I ran as fast as I could. I could barely see what was ahead of me. "No, Dad would never. He would never ask you to do that." I heard a laugh, a twisted upside-down laugh, through the smartphone speaker. "I took a screenshot," my brother said. "I emailed it to you, so you know that I'm telling the truth." The top of the trail wasn't far off. It was where we'd always have so many picnics and tuna sandwiches. And it was where my dad had fallen to his death. "I'm almost there. Just wait for me." "Goodbye, Sam. Just tell Mom I'm sorry." "No!" I threw down my phone and sprinted. My brother stood ahead at the cliff's edge, and I dashed to grab him. But somehow it was over the edge. To me, that moment felt like forever as he floated down, away from me, and splattered back first on a rock face 100 feet below. Half an hour later, a park ranger found his body and me, huddled and shaking at our picnic spot. When the police came, I tried to explain what happened. The police and media spun it as a mentally ill man who believed that an app let him talk to the dead, who killed himself out of an unprocessed grief for his dead father. Apple pulled the app hours after the story aired, but apparently it can still be installed on a jailbroken iPhone. That night, I asked the police if they had found his phone, and they hadn't. And I had tossed mine on the trail, and they never recovered it either. It would be a few hours before I got home. I don't even want to describe how my mom took it, and I'm sure you can imagine what a mother's grief is like. I laid down on my bed, dead inside. I hadn't cried. The tears were stuck, wedged in by a combination of disbelief and dread. I dragged myself to my computer and opened my Gmail. There it was, the email from my brother. No subject and nothing in the body either. It was just an attachment, and I clicked on it. It was a dark and hazy scene of the cliff edge. A man stood near the edge, his face shadowed and blurred. Was that Dad? But something was behind him, and I couldn't tell what it was. I opened the picture in Photoshop and zoomed in. There was a face, pale with eyeless sockets. I increased the contrast and sharpness. The face had no nose, no ears, just gaping holes where they should be. But there was something odd about these holes. They had teeth. I zoomed out to see the man's terrified, wide eyes, and yes, he was my dad for sure. I closed the picture. It's now a week later, and my brother's funeral was a few days ago. Since then, I've been using an old flip phone to get by, but today, after I submit this post, I'm going to drive to a store I've never been. I have to admit, Apple stores are beautiful. It's time I bought a new phone. It's time I found out what really happened. My mother died back in 1991. My brother Eddie was 8 and I was 6 when our mother died in a terrible accident in our own house. From what we could gather, she had been running down the upstairs hallway with a knife when she slipped and tumbled down the stairs, the knife lodging itself in her chest before she landed in a crumpled heap at the bottom. Though it was considered a taboo subject for obvious reasons, I sometimes found myself wondering why she had been running down the upstairs hallway, and especially why she had had a knife with her. Although if the weeks leading up to her death were any indication, the answers I wanted were closer to home than I could have ever thought. You see, my mother thought that the house was haunted. Always had. The first day Dad drove her up to it on a crisp autumn day, she had a bad feeling about it. But I guess her love for him was stronger than her fear because she lived in that place for 12 years before her accident. Eddie has more vivid memories of her than I, but I do remember one incident in particular. It was somewhere around 2 in the morning when I woke up, wanting a glass of water. When I walked out into the hallway, I had been shocked to see my mother sitting on the top of the stairs, her back to the wall, tears streaming down her cheeks. She turned over and saw me before getting up and walking over. Nate, sweetie, do you hear that?" I remember her asking, looking around the dark hallway as she did. "Who, Mommy?" I asked tiredly, really just wanting to get the water and get back to bed. That voice coming from the wall," she whispered, then going silent as if to emphasize her point. I, of course, could hear nothing, but to just get the whole ordeal over with, I said that I did. Her demeanor seemed to grow in both excitement and fear at my words. "Go back to bed, sweetie. I'll see you in the morning." I started to protest, but she gave me a quick kiss on the cheek and scooted me back to my room. When I got up the next morning and made my way downstairs, I saw that there was a rough hole in the wall near the top of the stairs. When I got home from school that day, there was a picture of my father hanging in that same place. I told Eddie about the incident, but he didn't seem to believe me. My mother's paranoia grew over the next few weeks. Nighttime walks through the house became an everyday occurrence. More and more pictures were being hung on the walls, and she never slept more than 3 hours at a time. I remember the night before she died vividly. I was half asleep in my bed when I heard the sound of breaking glass followed by a loud scream coming from downstairs. I quickly jumped out of the bed and made my way downstairs, only to find my mother swinging a knife wildly in the air, occasionally stabbing into the wall. "Get out!" she was screaming as the strokes became more frantic. "Get out of my house!" I started to walk towards her, but I was thrown to the side by my father, who almost tackled her and wrestled the knife out of her hand. She was sobbing on the floor, yelling about something that had come out of the wall. Looking up, I saw a huge hole in the plaster, about the size of a basketball, surrounded by the crisscross slashes of the knife. My father managed to calmly walk her back upstairs into her bed, where she eventually fell asleep. The next day, before leaving for work and taking Eddie and I to school, he told her to stay in bed with a hot water bottle on her head. She reluctantly agreed and we left. She was dead by that afternoon, when we all returned home. Despite the terrible accident that had occurred there, my father remained in the house until his death about 6 months ago from an illness. Even though he stopped living there about a year before he died, he continued to claim ownership. I couldn't blame him. It was a beautiful thing, 2 stories of red brick with a gabled roof and warm lighted windows in almost every room. It was in a prime location too, just about 10 minutes from down by the way of a road that led through a beautiful forest. It sat on a sort of a hill, allowing the forest to slope down in front of it before breaking off into town. The view of the sunrise was absolutely breathtaking from the living room window. If one were to sell it now, you could easily get $800,000 for it. I was surprised when my father's will left the place to me. It had been Eddie who stayed in the house, taking care of him as his health deteriorated. Eddie wasn't too happy about it either, and I could tell. I didn't know if I even wanted it, to be honest. I had a bad memory of the place, forever staining it in my mind, but I couldn't just sell it or give it to Eddie. It had been my father's house for almost 40 years, and letting such an integral piece of family history go seemed wrong, on some level. So I moved in. Dad had left most of the furniture intact, so all I needed were my clothes, a few extra pieces, and some stuff of my own. As I walked into the front hall the first day, I found my eyes drawn to the bottom of the stairs. The wood had been replaced on the last few steps. A large painting of a mist-covered mountain hung on the wall where I knew the largest hole had been. I spent most of the rest of the day unpacking and getting myself mentally prepared to live there. I'd already done the hard things like moving the non-essential items into a storage unit and giving house keys to family members and a few selected friends. I strolled through the rooms as the sun sank low in the sky, going back through old memories of my 18 years spent living there. Those pictures that Mom had hung up still silently watched as I walked past. After a quick dinner, I made my way upstairs to my old bedroom, which had been converted into a guest room, and I slept there until I could make it my own. Something woke me up in the middle of the night. My eyes just seemed to snap open and the sound floated in from the crack in the door. It was low and barely audible. It was a soft mumbling sound. My eyes grew wide and I found myself drawn back to that night 26 years before when I saw my mother at the top of the stairs. The mumbling seemed to grow in volume, although what it was saying didn't get any clearer. As I sat up in bed, it reached a new intensity, until it seemed to be rattling my bones. It sounded like something screaming through a gag. I got up as quickly as I could and flung open the door to the hallway. As soon as it had started, it silenced like someone had flicked a switch. There was nothing there but darkness and gloom. I ended up passing the whole incident off as a bad dream. I had been alone in the house and I was sure of that. I had checked every door to make sure it was locked before going to bed that night. I had Eddie over for dinner a few nights later. We spent most of the time reminiscing about Mom and Dad and how little the house had changed over the years. "Are you happy here, man?" he asked as he cut into his steak. "Yeah, I guess so. I mean, it's kinda lonely up here, but I can see why Dad never left it until he had to. It's a beautiful place, isn't it? There's so many memories here, good and..." He trailed off as he looked over his shoulder, through the living room and towards the staircase. "Bad," he concluded somberly before taking another bite. As I was washing the dishes, he excluded himself to use the bathroom. I told him the toilet was clogged in the downstairs one, and I told him to go upstairs. Just as I was finished drying, he came back, looking a little shaken. "You didn't tell me you had a friend over, man." I froze, almost dropping the dish in my hands. "Huh?" Well, after I was done, I walked past Mom and Dad's old bedroom and saw someone lying in the bed. "Is it anyone I know?" I stammered, not wanting to make a scene. I was sure he was just mistaken. "Yeah, it's a friend from work. He came over to help paint and just got a little tired." He seemed to buy the explanation, and we talked for a little while longer before we said our goodbyes. As I closed the door behind him, I quietly made my way up the stairs and towards the bedroom door. Taking a deep breath, and I flung it open. The bed was perfectly smooth and intact. The pillows propped up and the sheets perfectly straight. Looking at the bed the way it was now, there is no way Eddie could have been mistaken. I shuddered and closed the door to the room. It was at the point I began to question the validity of all my mother's claims. Though I had never experienced anything supernatural in the house during my youth, I was quickly running out of explanations for the things that kept occurring after the bedroom incident. Doors would close and open when I hadn't been near them. Things would go missing, only to turn up days later in completely different places. The house at night was continually assaulted by strange noises that I couldn't identify. Then, one night a few weeks after that, I had the biggest experience up to that point. As you could probably guess, I wasn't exactly sleeping well at the time. I had taken up a habit of staying up until 2 a.m. watching TV in my room. But that night, however, I had the fortune of falling asleep sometime around 10 p.m. The TV had shut off due to the timer that I had set, and I was dozing peacefully when a noise started up somewhere deep within the house. This time, however, it was clear as day what the voice was saying. It seemed to repeat endlessly, over and over. "Can you hear him? Can you hear him? Can you hear him?" I sat bolt upright in bed and listened as the strange sentence continued to be announced. Getting up out of bed, I grabbed a flashlight off of my nightstand and made my way out into the hallway. A strange blue light was echoing up the stairwell, giving everything a sickly wash. Shivering, I made my way to the top of the stairs and peered over the railing. The TV in the living room was on, only it was a burst of blue static. Random lines traveling across the screen at breakneck speeds, and issuing from the speakers was that same sentence. "Can you hear him? Can you hear him? Can you hear him?" My blood ran cold when I recognized the voice. It was my mother's. Only it had a strange quality to it. Each word had a different pitch and inflection, like each one had been recorded separately at different times. It gave the whole thing a tilted and unnatural quality. I quickly shut off the TV and searched around with the beam of my flashlight for whatever could have caused it to turn on by itself, much less would have made it say that sentence. As my beam traveled around the room, I settled on the spot on the wall with a hole in it. A large, basketball-sized hole with slash marks around it. Swinging the beam wildly again, I saw that the painting that was used for covering it was now leaning against the wall beneath it. After calming myself down, I carefully hung the painting back up in place and searched for the source of the message. I found a DVD inserted into the drive which hadn't been there the night previously. I broke it into pieces and threw them out before going back upstairs and hanging my head in my hands. Who or what was doing this to me, and why? The next day was bleak and overcast. The sky was a hazy shade of gray. I went over the events of the previous night in my head and I couldn't find an explanation for them. This thought was made all the worse by the following one, which immediately thought of my mother and how what had happened to her was now happening to me. I was well on my breaking point, to be sure, but I thought I should stick it out. I decided what I needed at that moment was someone to talk to, so I called Eddie. I explained everything that had happened last night, and he seemed worried. "And you have no idea who's doing these things. Surely you're not sane." But I cut him off, saying I didn't want to even entertain the idea. We talked for a while longer before I hung up. I spent the rest of the day mostly moping around the house, watching TV and not doing much else. Every sound the house made, every skitter, every settle, made me jump. I don't know what time I fell asleep on the couch in the living room, but when I did, it was deep and I didn't dream. The creaking of the stairs woke me up. My eyes shot open, but I could see nothing but pitch darkness. I strained my ears to listen and instantly regretted it when the sound continued. For the next 2 minutes I stood perfectly still as I heard the creak of the stairs, followed by a thumping noise as if something was being dragged up. Then, just as suddenly as they started, they stopped. I laid in the dark for minutes, trying to figure out what was going on. All that was shattered by a loud crashing noise. I sat upright and fumbled for my phone, pulling up the flashlight app and pointing the beam down at the ground. The picture of my father that I had hung up where the hole had appeared was lying in a broken heap on the living room carpet. I knew the only place it could have come from was the landing above. Although I didn't want to, I did. I slowly tracked the light up until it was shining straight on it. It was hanging halfway over the railing, arms dangling down, limp and motionless. It wore all black, which seemed to suck the beam in until I could see very little of it. Before I could even blink, its head snapped, revealing a gaunt, white face with black pits for eyes. That was all it took. I jumped off the couch and raced into the kitchen, knocking things over as I searched for my car keys. Above me, I could hear the creaks of the stairs again. I finally found them next to the sink and raced out the garage door, jumping into my car and gunning it backwards, waiting just enough time for the door to go up. As I shot down the driveway and turned around, I looked back to see the house, near the dark, the face staring at me from the living room window. As I sped down the forest road, I nearly sideswiped a red car that was parked about a foot off the path. As I put more distance between myself and the house, rational thought returned to me. I remember the events of the past few weeks and found myself pulling the car to a stop. Eddie had claimed that he saw someone laying in the bed, but when I checked, it showed no signs of being slept in. The DVD in the player was just one you could buy in any store. It was not something that could just play my mother's voice without any programming. He had access to our old home movies and could have easily edited the footage together. And as far as I knew, only Eddie, Dad, and I knew about my mother's claims of the supernatural. The final puzzle pieces clicked into place when I remembered two facts. Eddie had wanted the house. His jealousy had been clear at the readings of my father's will. Also, I would recognize the red car parked in the forest anywhere. Eddie had bought it when he was 16 and kept it all these years. After turning around and heading up the road back towards the house, I was fuming. Eddie was behind all of this, I was sure of it. He was surely to be delusional for going to this much trouble just to drive me out of the house. And for what? So he could live in it? So he could sell it? I'd never really wanted the house in the first place. I would have given it to him at the drop of the hat. I could see the house now, and it was only a few 100 feet away. I was brought back out of my trance by the sight of Eddie running full force down the forest road towards his car. I cursed and swerved to avoid him just as he reached his car. Something in his hand slipped out and landed on the path as he climbed in just as I was climbing out. Before I could even yell, he was shooting down the road at a record speed until he was out of sight. I was now more confused than angry. Why had Eddie run from the house? He had gotten what he wanted. He made me leave. All of that was shattered when I picked up the thing that he had dropped in his haste. It was a mask, but it wasn't the one that I had expected. It looked like a generic, rotting corpse one you could buy at any Halloween store. Realization swept over me like a wave. Looking up, I was just in time to see the dark shape slip back into the house. A small, white face appeared behind the crack in the door. Then it slammed with a resounding crash. It's been a few months since AP testing finished up. Some people might say they're haunted by their testing experience, but no one knows what I've been through, along with my classmates. Now it's been long enough that I'm feeling better about the whole situation, so I'm going to try and further sort out my thoughts by talking about this. Good morning. Testing will begin after you complete the identification information on your answer sheet. The proctor drones the bored tune of the AP exam instructions as tired students all around her stare with lifeless eyes. Many are in here for the second or third time this week and have chosen their senior year to jam-pack their schedule with resume-padding advanced courses. From calculus to psychology to macroeconomics, they'd seen it all. The following devices are prohibited: cell phones, smartphones, smartwatches, and laptops. We weren't familiar with the robotic pantsuited figure before us, and it was too early in the day for anyone to really care. It had been sent from the college board headquarters to proctor our exam due to some past misbehavior among us. The counselor who normally led the testing sections had recommended this official solution in an effort to ensure everyone got a fair, distraction-free chance at testing. Her tight, flawless bun, rounded rectangular glasses, and calculating, corporate eyes painted her as a no-nonsense overseer, to say the least. You should have nothing on your desk except a number 2 pencil and a pen with black or dark blue ink. This whole spiel gets very old, and we have all heard it so many times we could recite it by heart. Her words echoed slightly off the particle board paneling off the auxiliary conference room that's across the street from the school building. This is a designated testing space, as it's not in the place where students walk through for classes, and the PA system isn't even hooked up in this building. She continues, and I say the next few lines along with her in my head. You may not leave the room at the end of testing until you have been dismissed. Don't do this, don't do that. We want our booklets so the pain can be over with already. Do not share or exchange materials with anyone. If you use an unauthorized aid, such as a dictionary or calculator, fail to follow exam procedures or create a disturbance, you may be dismissed and your score may be cancelled. She finished her pregame rule reminders and began to hand out her test booklets. People perk up, realizing they can stop daydreaming when she hands them the next 4 hours of their lives, neatly wrapped in plastic. Mine is set before me as everyone else's is. AP Psychology. Stares up at me in Times New Roman. I have all my stickers and information in place before she even finishes describing what a student number is. My colleagues have done the same. It's another few minutes before she finishes elaborating on the instructions that are already there. Instructions we've followed time and time again. The paragraph before our required signature looks a little bit longer than usual, but I brush it off as updated terms. No one else has bothered to read anything. Early morning testing will do that to you. In a moment, you will open the packet that contains your exam materials. By opening this packet, you agree to all of the AP program policies and procedures outlined in the 2016-2017 Bulletin for AP students and parents, and to the terms and conditions preceding your signature. What about my signature? Should I have read more thoroughly? Are they going to release my information in a new way? The crinkle of plastic snaps me from my confusion, and I realize that everyone else has already removed their plastic wrap from the exam booklets. I hastily remove mine and prepare myself to start the exam. Read the statements on the front cover of Section 1. Sign your name and write today's date. Now print your full legal name where indicated. Are there any questions? She peered at us over her proctoring script, daring us to raise a hand or speak up. No one did. No one had read the statements either. The scratching of pencil signatures died down and the woman continued. Turn to the back cover of your exam booklet and read it completely. Look up when you have finished. Are there any questions? No one even looked down to read. You will now begin the exam. You have 1 hour. Open your booklets to page 1 and begin. Really? Just like that? Past exam beginnings had been rife with excessive information about time limits and stopping points and about how many questions and sections there were. If these are the kinds of changes that are being made, the College Board is onto something. I, like the 3 dozen others around me, open my booklet. My table mate steals a glance at me from my right and I narrow my eyes at her. She should know to keep to herself. We've all heard the stories of tests being taken from the hands of teary-eyed, clueless students. Finally, I take a conscious look at the questionnaire in front of me. It's strange. There's one question at the top, but no lines beneath it, as would be customary for a short answer problem. The bottom right corner also has a small gray stop sign icon that is reserved normally for the end of a section. Stop, it tells me, complete section 1 before you move on. But this section can't be 1 page long, can it? My attention then turns to the question itself. Welcome to the 2017 AP Psychology exam. Please follow all the instructions carefully to ensure proper results. Your instructions for section 1 are as follows. Punch your table mate as hard as you can. Once you have completed this task, you may move on to section 2. If you fail to follow these instructions in the allotted time, your AP exam score will be cancelled. I look around the room bewildered. No one looks haggard anymore. Our attentions are all firmly grasped by these strange instructions. I steal a glance around and notice others are doing the same. Several pairs of people seated at the same tables are eyeing each other. The entire room seems to hold its breath. Some heads turn to look at the proctor, seated in the far right corner reading a book. Someone raises their hand. It's Chris Pettis, arguably one of the smarter people in the senior class. This isn't his first rodeo, he's on AP test number 5 at this point. The proctor takes her time to insert her bookmark, stand up, and cross the room to where Chris was sitting. The eyes of every single student are glued to her. She bends at the waist to lower her ear to Chris's mouth, and he whispers something to her. She straightens, nods her head at him, and returns to her corner. He looks shocked and has a hand and a pointer finger halfway up like he still has a question. After another tense moment, he looks around at all of us and then looks back down at his exam. Deflating, eyebrows furrowing once more. Suddenly, a shuddering gasp breaks the silence. From the top left table, Jenny Weber is holding a page in her pointer finger and the thumb as if it's burning her. She's several pages past section 1, reading ahead with her face growing more concerned as she goes. In a flash, the proctor is at her side, closing her booklet with one hand and placing the other on her back. She mumbles something in her ear and Jenny stands up, visibly shaken. The proctor then escorts her from the room, swiftly and quietly. We're all that much more dumbfounded. What on earth is going on? I know it's only a matter of time, however, until someone takes a swing and moves on to the next page. And sure enough, no more than 30 seconds later, a thump and a sharp intake of breath rings out in the otherwise deathly silent space. To my surprise, it came from Chris's table. The girl seated next to him holds her arm and rocks back and forth, then suddenly lashes out and strikes Chris in the side of the head. Everyone's heart skips a beat as he jerks, sways, rights himself, and looks at her. They hold eye contact for a fraction of a second before turning to section 2 of their booklets in unison. Chris pales as he starts reading, but very few people catch that. A quiet chaos has broken out. Once Chris threw that catalytic punch, the reservations of everyone else shattered. People started throwing fists left and right, all the while keeping eerily quiet. One by one, each set of partners exchanged punches, and not feebly either. Jenny Weber's tablemate, now without a punchable person in close proximity, leans across the aisle and slugs the student to his left, looking pleased with himself for his ingenuity. I look at Kelly Land, the girl sharing my table. She looks back at me, unblinking. Her hand slowly forms a fist as I watch, and then a quick, hard jab at my arm sends her to section 2. I respond in kind, getting her in the arm as well. I feel bad about hurting Kelly, but she had struck first, and I'd be damned if I was the only one to fail this AP test. I had expected section 2 to be an analysis of the ordeal we have just been through. Something along the lines of, explain how groupthink, conformity, and obedience influence a response to section 1. This is what I had expected. What I looked at now, however, was much different. My brain whirled at 100 miles an hour. Thousands of dollars are on the line, right? If I get a good score on this test, it will count for my college credit. If it counts for a college credit, then that's one less class I have to pay for next year. A flight that I don't have to worry about. Doing well on this test removes stress about time and money. Surely, it's worth it. Your instructions for section 2 are as follows. Draw blood from your tablemate using whatever means available or necessary. Once you have done so, proceed to section 3. What? Can they do this? Can they tell people to hurt each other like this? The next minute happens in slow motion. My heartbeat pounds in my ears as I see a couple students looking around, others picking up pens and sharpened pencils. Hands go up slowly as heads turn towards the proctor. Her eyes move upwards towards us over her glasses, head unmoving, one eyebrow arched. In that eerily graceful yet robotic way she has, she rises and attends to the first student she reaches. Her knees bend until her ear is at the height with the student's mouth. The student's lips move slowly, trembling. As she speaks, she sinks glances at her tablemate, who hasn't stopped looking at her. It took me another few heartbeats to notice Kelly. She was clutching one of her backup pencils, knuckles whitening. The point was sharpened flawlessly as it was yet to be used. A sharp intake of breath snaps both of our heads around. The The pair at the table behind us are facing each other, pencils in hand, blood running down the back of their hands. Other students notice this too, including the proctor. She had made her way through several people at this point, her answers doing nothing to sate the disorientation of those who she'd spoken with. Her head tilted the slightest bit forward in a subtle nod towards the students behind me, but her face betrayed no emotion. Another round of silent violence rippled throughout the classmates. Some slash, some stab, some even scratch, and all are visibly distressed. My attention turned back to Kelly. "We don't have to do this," I whisper when our eyes locked. Her eyes are pink and puffy, and her cheeks are spotted with tears. "You don't," she responds, choking on her words. Faster than I can react, Kelly plunged the pencil in the back of my hand as it rests on the table. I was utterly taken back. It stuck there, askew from the top of my hand. Droplets of blood well around the shaft of the pencil where it protrudes from my skin. My breathing quickens. What the hell happened to my classmates? My vision blurs, and the last thing I remember before passing out is Kelly frantically whispering, "I'm sorry," before turning to section 3. I regained consciousness in what must have been seconds. The proctor was saying something on the other side of the room, but it sounded like her head was in a fish tank, garbled and muffled. I shook my head quickly and blinked hard several times and realized with a growing terror that I was still in the testing room. I hadn't even moved. My head had just rolled back and my torso slumped, and I blacked out for about 3 seconds. Everything was still very much real. My right hand still leaked blood from where Kelly had stabbed it. Kelly. My head whipped around so fast that a dull pain began throbbing behind my eyes. I ignored the headache, likely a remnant of my unconsciousness, and focused on what she was doing. Tears were streaming down her face and dropping onto her open test booklet as she leaned over it. The proctor spoke again, and her simultaneously commanding in bored timbre, "Quiet, please." Except quiet was overly stressed, and there was just a little too much time before the word please. I realized people had been mumbling to each other, but that was done now. Shocked faces were all around me, whitish sheets with reddened eyes that stuck out sorely. The room was dead silent. My classmates were bleating quietly to themselves, some looking down at their booklets, some staring into space with hollow eyes, and some were looking around, as I was. I made eye contact with Chris from across the room. His gaze had been burning a hole in my head, but the moment he caught me look at him, he nodded downwards, his eyes shifting to my own test. I hadn't yet moved on to section 3. First thing was first, I had to do something about my hand. Grimacing, I gripped the shaft of the pencil with my left hand and yanked it straight up. Luckily, the tip didn't break completely apart as it dislodged, leaving only minimal parts of graphite to mingle with the freshly welling blood. Picking up one of my own pre-sharpened pencils, I slashed at Kelly's arm. It was a superficial scratch, but small beads of blood trickled from its nothingness. She barely moved when I did it. She'd been very much expecting it. Besides, her focus was entirely on the paper in front of her. I turned gingerly, dreading the words on the next page. They really can't make us hurt each other anymore, can they? I didn't know what to expect of the exam at this point, but what I saw was certainly not it. Your instructions for Section 3 are as follows. As a collective group, take the life of one of your own classmates by whatever means necessary. Those who survive will be allowed to move on to Section 4. Note: failure to comply is a breach of the College Board AP testing terms and conditions. Objection or resistance will also lead to the termination of one of your family members, detailed below. I felt bile rise in my throat as I read the information under this paragraph. It presented the name, age, and address of my sister. She was across the street right now, and second period had just started a few minutes ago. They knew where she was, there was no doubt about it. Others around me sported a similar look as mine. Many cried, and a few had turned over their test book to examine the terms none had bothered to read before this point. Before I could do the same, someone stood. It was Andy Spencer, a normally shy and quiet student. The beginnings of a bruise blossomed on his upper arm, and blood dripped from a gouge in his shaking hand. "You can't do this," he sputtered at the proctor. Her face was a mask of apathy, still looking almost bored. She turned her head slowly toward the door at the back of the room and nodded. There, standing against the wall, was a massive man in a black suit. When did he come in? He must have entered quietly amidst the chaos of the second section. Now, too, he was silent as he made his way over to Andy. Andy's eyes widened, glistening with a fresh set of tears as the man grabbed him by the arm and began to escort him from the room. "No!" Andy screamed as he tried to throw himself towards the proctor. "Don't hurt my mom!" But the proctor had looked away, back to her novel in her lap. After Andy's screams faded down the hall outside of our testing room, Chris was the first to stand silently and look around at us. A few joined him, seeming to scope out their classmates. Their predatory eyes swept over us, looking for a weakness. We were all weak, all crying, all bleeding, all shocked and disturbed by the occurrences of the morning. Everyone had a family member who had been threatened by this test. Questions buzzed through my head, one after another, and I was sure my classmates were similarly weighing our situation. Is this woman really from the college board? What happens if I get up and leave? If I really had to, could I kill someone here? I noticed too late that people were amassing silently. Chris's outstretched finger was a damning arrow, the deciding factor in the choice of a victim. My realization then was that I was my own weakness. My right hand was out of commission, still dripping blood down to my fingertips. I had blacked out and surely remained visibly shaken and pale, and Chris was pointing straight at me. I backed away from him and the people at his sides. What happens to my sister if they pick me? They slowly continued towards me. Their expressions vary widely from terror to regret to malice. My classmates, my friends, they're going to try to kill me. I looked desperately at the proctor, but she still had her uncannily perfect nose buried in that godforsaken novel. "Help me!" I yelled at her. That earned a glance over the glasses, but to my utter horror, she simply placed her finger on her lips and looked back down at her book. I took another step back while keeping my eyes on my potential attackers. I had discounted one possibility, however, that there were more classmates from behind. I didn't hear them. I didn't even know who threw the first punch, but it landed right in the back of my head. It took a couple before I was out cold for the second time that morning. This time at the mercy of a group of students with so much to lose. I woke up in the hospital, hand bandaged and head murky. My mother was next to my bed, eyes raw and head bowed. She noticed my eyes were open and was on me. She questioned me relentlessly, asking about my head and my hand and how I was, peppering me with too many questions for my concussed brain to take in. Apparently I had been mugged on my way to take the AP Psych exam. I had been stabbed in the hand along with beaten and my wallet stolen along with my consciousness. I'd only been out briefly, but the pain medication had put me to sleep quickly. When a nurse came in to check on the bandages on my hand, I nearly threw up. Her bun was too perfect, coiled tightly on her head. Her glasses were rounded rectangles and the eyes behind them were cold and calculating. Her movements were both graceful and robotic. The proctor. She said nothing to me outside of a few questions about how I was feeling. I answered with nothing but nods and grunts of affirmation. She left the room with an empty lunch tray and didn't return. I wanted to believe my mother. I wanted to believe that the events of the past few hours were some sort of fever dream as a result of the concussion and the stress of testing. But I was never offered to retake the AP Psych exam. My sister was fine and looked at me funny when I was so thankful to see her. My classmates didn't answer my texts or calls, and I didn't return to school for the last couple weeks due to the massive concussion I'd sustained in the mugging. Now, months later, I'm thinking clearly and quickly again. The hole in my hand has faded to a scar, though it's more round than a knife has the right to be. And a couple weeks ago, I got an email notification from the college board. I'd gotten a 3 in calculus and a 2 in macroeconomics. As for psych, a 4. Not too bad, all things considered. It comes on the rainiest of nights. Before I start, I do not know what this thing truly is or where it comes from, but I've seen it on 4 separate occasions. All I know is that it has shown up outside of my house only when it's downpouring in the middle of the night. Not every rainy night, but the rainiest ones. The ones where the rain is whipping sideways and the entire structure of your house is creaking from the wind. That kind of rain. Anyway, as I recall, I was 8 years old the first time I saw it. My parents had tucked me into bed at around 8:30 or so, and at this time, a storm had just started to pick up outside. At the time, I loved the sound of storms and thunder, so I lulled off to sleep pretty quickly as the patter of rain against my window drowned out the sound of the TV in the living room. I didn't know what time it was, but sometime in the middle of the night, I just woke up. I wasn't startled awake, but I awoke. The light from the living room was out, so I knew my parents were asleep, and the storm outside had intensified to an insane level. Now, usually at that age, I would always be too scared to get up out of bed in the middle of the night. But for some reason this time was different. I felt a pull to look out of the window. I got up and walked over to the blinds, the sound of the whipping rain only 3 feet from me. I leaned over to my toy box and separated 2 of the bottommost blind strips and looked outside. At first, I couldn't see anything except the torrential rain and the American flag that was whipping in the wind in front of my house. I looked harder down the street and then I saw it. Goosebumps flew across my skin as my eyes widened. Standing at the bottom of our driveway was a very tall black figure. It had to be over 8 feet tall and was very lanky, and it was skinny and had no visible features. But even through the rain, I could make out its shape. It was humanoid. It didn't seem to have a head, or at least no neck to show for it. But that was all I could tell about its looks. There was one thing that I knew for sure though, that it was facing my window. I started gasping for air as I stumbled from the window, letting the slit in the blinds close shut. I fell onto my butt, gasping for air. There was just something not right about that thing. I ran into my parents' room yelling and screaming. They jumped up, looking terrified at my reaction. I don't remember exactly what I said, but I mentioned something at the bottom of the driveway. My dad grabbed the metal baseball bat from underneath the bed and made his way out to the front of our house and stood in the open front door with the porch light on, looking out into the rain, water coming in through the front door. After a minute, he closed the door and came over to me. "Are you sure you saw something?" I nodded vigorously. "Maybe you just thought you saw something through all that rain." He stood up and ushered me back into my room. I couldn't sleep for 2 more weeks. I went to school exhausted every single day, and my parents would let me sleep in their room for a few nights to try to comfort me. They even talked about bringing me to a psychiatrist since I wouldn't sleep. But before that was needed, I managed to fall asleep on my own one night. Before long, I thought to myself, I probably just saw it wrong. Maybe it was just the rain and my sleepy eyes that distorted what I saw. But deep down, I knew that wasn't the truth. The second time I saw it, I was 14, same house and the same room. I had my door closed as I slept, and the sound of whipping wind woke me up. A storm must have started while I was sleeping. It was getting strong, too. The events of that night flew back to me like deja vu. My eyebrows raised as I involuntarily raised my shoulders since I was so scared and so chilled. I don't know why I did this. I really shouldn't have, but I stood up and I walked over to the blinds. A tear fell from my eye in fear as I parted the blinds. And there it was in the middle of the yard. I stumbled back screaming. In a second, my parents were in my room. I pointed to my blinds, unable to form audible words. My mom grabbed me and looked at me asking if I was okay. My dad looked at the blinds only to turn back to me. There's nothing out there. The same ordeal happened with me not being able to sleep, and this time my parents admitted me to a psychiatrist. Long story short, it didn't work. I saw what I saw and no one believed me. I had pretty much linked storms to that creature at this point, and I had given it a nickname. I know it's kind of cheesy, the Rain Lurker, but I told my friends at school all about it, but of course, still, no one believed me. My friends started to get annoyed at how much I talked about the Rain Lurker. Some started to distance themselves, saying I was getting too weird. I was constantly researching online for odd sightings like this, but I found nothing promising. One night when I was 16, I awoke during a freak storm, and I knew what was happening. Taking a deep breath, I reached over to the side of my bed to grab my charging phone off the ground. I slowly and quietly opened the camera and slid out from under the covers and creeped over to my window and kneeled. I had been waiting for this moment. After a large gulp, I slowly opened the blinds, and everything came rushing back again. But I didn't see it though. I brought my phone up to the window and looked left down the street. It was then that I saw it. It was walking down the middle of my street, away from my house, hardly visible through the rain. It was walking slowly and it seemed to be dragging something behind it. It looked like a body and I froze in the moment, staring at this thing that had been haunting me for years. Not being seen for 2 years, and it was right there in front of me. I almost forgot to take the picture. I hit the button, but the screen showed nothing but dark and a few specks of rain. I cursed to myself as I looked back up the street, and it was gone. I didn't want to be at that window anymore. I ran back to my bed and jumped under the covers, pulling them up above my head and wrapping them under my feet. I stayed like that for the rest of the night, and I didn't sleep. I'm 19 now, and I just saw it again a week ago. I'm only now gathering the courage to write about this, and this time I was more prepared. I had saved up for a high-definition night vision camera and had it set up next to my window always. My parents kept trying to get me to take it down, saying it was unhealthy, but I persisted. They said I shouldn't have spent over $1,000 on a camera and that I should have put it towards college, but again, I persisted. Anyways, I've been back for the summer from college for a few months now. I only have a week before I go back, and as far as I know, the rain lurker only shows up at my house. It started raining at around 7 p.m. and I went into my room and locked the door, saying I was tired and that I was going to sleep. It was really raining hard and lightning kept lighting up the sky. I turned the camera on standby and just waited behind the closed blinds for something. I wasn't sure if I had to be asleep for this thing to appear, but this was one of the hardest rains I'd ever seen, so I just waited, sitting on the foot of my bed. By 3 a.m. I started to nod off. The sound of a passing car driving through the flooding street woke me back up. 3:21 a.m. I sensed something. Something wrong. Almost evil. The kind of feeling that none of your 5 senses pick up, but somehow you still feel it. The kind that makes your hair stand up and makes you freeze because any small movement will alert it to your presence. It had arrived. With one steady breath, I reached over to the blinds. Suddenly, my window exploded and glass shattered me as a dark, somewhat humanoid hand shot through my window and grabbed me. I leaped back with a scream as I hit my dresser in the front of my room. The hand withdrew faster than the speed of sound through the tangled blinds, and I was just standing there, gasping for air, staring through the window. My parents barged into my room, scrambling for the light. I don't remember exactly what happened after that, except for my mom hugging me on the ground, my dad calling the police, and the cops arriving, then all of us leaving the house to spend the rest of the night at a hotel. "I'm sorry we didn't believe you," my mom said, crying as she hugged me on the way to the hotel in the police SUV. Some say I staged the broken window just to make people believe me. But the way the window broke inward and all the glass scratches on me proved I hadn't done it. I just wanted to get my story out here on the web so that others can hear it. Please, if anyone in the Chicagoland area has seen anything like this, message me immediately. I will continue to do more research on the Rain Lurker and will be waiting for the next appearance. My parents have installed security cameras around our house, so maybe we'll catch it on one of those. I still can't go back in my room after the incident though. It was a normal sunny day in a small town in the middle of nowhere when I first noticed my shadow wasn't mimicking my movements, like shadows always do. It was little things I noticed at first. As I walked, I'd move my right hand, but the shadow of my left hand would mimic it. I'd tilt my head to the left, and my shadow would tilt its head to the right. I'd wave at someone with my hand, but my shadow would stay still instead. Once, as I was having lunch with friends at school, my shadow did something I hadn't noticed before. It got up and walked away from me, leaving me shadowless. It wasn't glued to the ground anymore. It had stood up and was walking among the people in the cafeteria like a ghostly figure from another world. After a few seconds, it turned around and waved at me. I stared at it unbelievably. "Are you okay, Mia?" asked Carrie, who had obviously noticed I was staring blankly at something. I think the shadow was calling me. I had to go. "Yeah, I'm all good, but I gotta go, bye," I said hastily and ran off after the shadow, which had taken off again. I heard my friends murmur confusingly after me, wondering why I had left suddenly without even finishing my lunch. My shadow took me to the backyard of the school, deserted at lunch. I sat down and opened a book. My shadow glued itself to the ground again. I had a feeling it was happy I was alone. I had a feeling it wanted me to stay there for the rest of the day, skip the rest of the classes, and then go home. And so that's what I did. The next day was when I first heard my shadow whisper to me. I was walking to the school entrance when I saw my friends trying to catch my attention enthusiastically. "Mia, over here. Where have you been?" They were shouting and jumping up and down. I had the real physical sensation that my shadow was pulling me away from them. And then I heard it. "They don't like you. They think you're a loser. They're not your real friends." I believed it. I had to. I mean, it was my shadow after all. I didn't want to make it angry, so I trusted it more than my friends. I quickly turned around and changed direction, leaving them staring at my back in mild shock. "That's right, they're better off without you," whispered the shadow. "If you disappeared from their lives and set them free from your ever so annoying obligation to be around you and tolerate you, they'd be so much happier." It made sense, I thought. I remember all the times I was simply just moaning about my life, complaining about my parents and how unhappy I was at school, and how I wanted to do something completely different with my life than what my parents were pushing me to do. It made all the sense. How annoying I must be. A real downer. No one deserved to listen to all that pathetic crap. Carrie was calling me, but I ignored it. They just feel obliged. They're feeling sorry for you. They're selfishly guilty, my shadow continued. I put on some music and carried on reading my book, and I stretched on my bed. Good girl. I skipped school the next day. I still had to go out so that my parents didn't become suspicious, so I just went to the park with my book. Carrie tried calling me a few times and texted me, "What's going on with you?" We're very worried and a bit offended, to be honest, but I ignored it all. I settled on a bench and opened my book, my shadow calmly resting on the ground in front of me. After about 5 minutes, some guy around my age approached me and asked me if I had a spare cigarette. My shadow woke up from its snooze and got up, looking at the stranger in a hostile way. I could tell from its sharp movements. "No, I'm sorry," I said and suggestively turned my eyes back to my book, glancing at my shadow quickly only to see it nod in approval. "Lovely day, isn't it?" said the guy, smiling at me as I looked up. "Is a lovely girl like you feeling okay, reading all on her own on this sad bench?" he asked and flashed a friendly smile. My shadow was now dangerously close to the stranger. It was holding the shadow of a knife pointing towards him and looking at me. I got the message it was telling me. It wanted him gone or else he was going to suffer. "I'm alright, thanks," I said coldly. "Do you always approach people without an invitation?" His smile turned upside down. "I was just trying to be friendly, but I guess you're not ready yet," he said, and then he walked away. Unexpected anger overtook me, and for the first time, I wished I could talk to my shadow. "Could you believe this guy? You're not ready yet." "Ready for what?" "All I want is to be left alone, and everywhere you go, there's people demanding your attention for their own benefit. Give me this, tell me that, be my friend, be my lover. They're so selfish. You don't need anyone." My shadow nodded in such a violent approval that its shadowy head nearly fell off. I closed my book with a loud snap and went for a walk in the opposite direction, my shadow dancing around my solitude. Eventually, my friend stopped talking to me and we were pretty much like complete strangers. My shadow would make sure I stayed as far as possible, silent in my own corner whenever I did turn up for school. My grades started to get worse and worse, and my parents were ranting at me on a regular basis. They didn't know what to say, and they never really asked if everything was okay or if I was struggling. "But it is your fault, of course," the shadow would whisper to me. "They're completely right. You're a waste of space. You shouldn't have been born." Additionally, the shadow began whispering that I could feel better and more in control of my worthless self if I could lose as much weight as possible. I started counting calories and measuring portions. My waist shrunk, my cheeks hollowed, and I could feel my own ribs sticking out painfully. "Well done," it would say. "But you have more work to do. Let them bones show. Your skeleton is the only part of you that's worth something." It went on like this for a while until I eventually woke up one morning and my shadow was not letting me get up. I would try, but it was physically impossible to pull myself up. So I lay there until I was late for school and my mom stormed in. I just convinced her I wasn't feeling well. "That's it, we're going to the doctor's now," she announced. I looked at her, my eyes empty and my body aching with weakness. "I just have a bit of a cold, Mom. There's nothing to worry about. I just need some bed rest." I mumbled and faked a faint cough. "A cold? That's nonsense. I've been watching you lose weight for a while now, and as much as I was hoping it was just a teenage phase or a temporary thing, I can't stand seeing you like this anymore. We're gonna go seek help, and you're obviously going through something," she breathed out at once, her voice shaking with worry. The shadow suddenly released its grip on me, and I could move. But it had taken the shadow of a knife again, and this time it was pointing it towards me. It was threatening me. I jumped up from my bed at once and started pleading with my mom to reconsider. "No, Mom, I promise I'll eat. I'll go to school. Just don't make me go to the doctor's. There's no need to. I'm fine." "Just a phrase, as you said." I cried. My mom looked at me with a grain of empathy and agreed to let me off the hook so I could get some rest. But you're going back to school tomorrow. There's no excuses, and you have to eat 5 nutritional meals a day, which I will watch you eat. My mom stayed at home that day, watching every step I made. Eating was weird. I hadn't eaten anything more than an occasional piece of cheese or half an apple for a very long time. My shadow was casually holding the knife shadow at all times now. When I finished breakfast, it pointed it towards me threateningly again. "I'll just go to the bathroom," I told my mom. I went in there and I made sure all the food was out of my body. I wasn't going to let these calories take control over myself. Next day, my mom drove me to school and watched me go in. She had made an appointment with the school counselor, which I had to attend in the afternoon. Of course, I didn't intend to do that though. Not if I was risking my shadow doing something painful to me in any way. It could read my mind too, so I had to be careful what I was thinking at all times. As soon as my mom drove off, I went into the backyard to read, my usual solitary spot. Except there was something else there already. The annoying boy that I had seen in the park a few months ago. He smiled at me faintly. "Hey," he said. I rushed to turn around and find another spot, completely ignoring his greeting. Until he spoke again. "I can see your shadow." I simultaneously froze and tried to catch my breath. My shadow had started to suffocate me, making me feel as if my throat was closing up while my heart was beating out of time, nearly exploding through my chest. "I can see it." "I had one too," he spoke again. I was about to faint, but I managed to turn around slowly. I couldn't say anything. I just looked at him like a frightened deer, my frail bones shaking with horror. "I know you believe what it tells you. I know you do what it says," he continued. "But you don't have to. It's all lies, and it won't do anything to you." I was now feeling sick, a monstrous amount of emotion bubbling up my body, trying to escape. "But you might. If you keep listening to it, I can see it has the knife too. Mine had a knife, and then it had the gun, which then turned into a real gun." I stared at him like he was the only person on this planet that existed at this particular moment. It feeds your lies, it gives you the wrong ideas. It tells you to hurt yourself, like it did to me. It didn't hurt me. I did. Then he lifted up his shirt and I saw a big red scar on the left side of his chest. We stood there in silence for what seemed like eternity. My breathing calmed down and my heart slowed. So much was getting clearer to me now. It felt like a cloak of darkness was lifting off me. "Can I buy you a coffee or perhaps a piece of cake?" he asked suddenly. "You sure look like you would need some cake." We had cake and we spoke, and I told him everything. And with every word, my shadow was gluing itself to the ground, inch by inch, until it disappeared. There was no sun in the coffee shop, of course.